Hello fellow sapiens, and welcome to Sleepless Homo. This is your quiet corner of the internet, a place to let your thoughts slow down, to soften the noise, and to follow a story told at the pace of deep time. Whether you're here preparing to sleep, or just letting your mind rest while you cook, drive, work, or simply breathe, you're in the right place. If you appreciate this kind of calm, long-form storytelling, rooted in science, not speculation, I'd ask you to gently tap the like button and subscribe. It helps more curious people find these episodes. I also love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, do you listen to these stories before bed, while commuting or with headphones at work? Or maybe let me know where in the world you're tuning in from. Every answer helps shape this little community of sleepless humans, and if you happen to drift off in the middle of a chapter, don't worry. I always leave timestamps in the description so you can return the next day and pick up exactly where you left off. The whole journey, from beginning to end, is worth hearing. This channel isn't about wild theories or certainty. It's about soft science told softly, the best evidence we have presented humbly, with space left for what we don't yet know. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Now, tonight's story. The world's first money, gold, debt, and the origins of class. Imagine a grey afternoon in the year 1972, in the city of Varna on the Bulgarian Black Sea coast. At the time, this was not a place where archaeologists expected to make world headlines. It was a time when concrete housing blocks were rising across Eastern Europe, when bulldozers bit into the ground to prepare for new industrial projects. One such machine dug into a patch of earth on the western edge of Varna, and its operator noticed something odd among the soil: shards of pottery, pieces of bone, a glint of yellow. At first, this was nothing unusual. Workers often tossed such finds aside, seeing them as mere rubble. But what the machine had uncovered was not rubble. It was the threshold to a cemetery over 6,000 years old, a place that would come to be called the Varna Necropolis, and within it lay the oldest processed gold objects ever discovered anywhere on Earth. The archaeologist who was called to investigate was Ivan Ivanov, then a young and determined researcher working at the Varna Historical Museum. To understand the impact of what Ivanov and his team found, you have to picture the mindset of the early 1970s. Bulgaria was behind the Iron Curtain, archaeology was underfunded, and the prevailing view of Europe's prehistory was modest. The spotlight of early civilization was firmly fixed on Mesopotamia and Egypt. The idea that the shores of the Black Sea could hold something older, something unprecedented, seemed improbable. Yet that is exactly what the bulldozer had revealed. As Ivanov's team began to excavate, they uncovered grave after grave. Over 300 burial sites have since been catalogued at Varna, but one in particular has become legendary. It is known simply as Grave 43. Inside it lay the remains of a man, probably in his 40s, who had been buried with an astonishing wealth of gold. Beads, sceptres, ornaments, bracelets, and appliques, weighing more than 1 kilogram in total. This was not raw metal, but carefully worked objects, hammered, polished, and shaped with skill. For context, this was nearly 2,000 years before the pyramids of Giza rose in Egypt. It was more than 5,000 years before the invention of coins in ancient Lydia. Yet here, in the 5th millennium BCE Bulgaria, a man was laid to rest with treasures that spoke of wealth, status, and power. The discovery was a jolt to archaeology, because it forced scholars to confront a question they had rarely asked of prehistoric Europe. What did wealth mean before money? The burial at Grave 43 suggests that by around 4,500 BCE, people along the Black Sea coast were already distinguishing themselves not only by what they produced or consumed, but by what they possessed and displayed. The gold objects in Varna were not tools. They were not weapons of war. They were symbols. They were markers of identity. In a sense, they were the first visible signs of stratification, the social layering of human groups into those who had and those who did not. We must tread carefully here. Archaeology is often about interpretation, and there is a danger of projecting our own obsession with wealth backward in time. It is entirely possible that the Varna gold was not seen as money in any conventional sense. It may have been ritual, it may have been sacred, it may have been tied to cosmology. Yet the sheer concentration of worked metal in one grave, and its relative absence in many others, tells us something unambiguous. Not everyone in that community was equal. Some individuals were marked out as special, and the marker was gold. The accident of discovery in 1972 quickly turned into one of the most meticulous excavations in Eastern Europe. Ivanov's team worked through the 1970s and into the 1980s, cataloguing every bead, every bone, every scrap of pottery. They did so under difficult conditions. Bulgaria at the time was under communist rule, and the international academic community was not easily accessible. Publications in Bulgarian took years to filter into Western journals, yet word spread, and when photographs of the finds circulated, the impact was immediate. Here was proof that complex societies had existed in southeastern Europe long before the canonical civilizations of Mesopotamia or the Nile. The Varna necropolis is not just about gold, it is about the entire pattern of burials. Some graves contain rich assemblages, others contain almost nothing. Some hold male skeletons adorned with regalia, others hold women or children with modest offerings, and some contain symbolic burials with no human remains at all but carefully arranged artifacts. Taken together, this pattern reveals a society that was experimenting with roles, with ritual, and with hierarchy. It was not an egalitarian village, it was a society where the dead carried messages about the living order. What makes this all the more remarkable is the date. Radiocarbon analysis places the Varna necropolis firmly in the 5th millennium BCE, over 6,500 years ago. At that time, most of Europe was dotted with small farming settlements. People were just beginning to exploit copper ores, to expand their agricultural surplus, and to form trade networks that spanned rivers and coastlines. Yet here, in Varna, the level of craft and the symbolic investment in metalwork suggest a leap in social imagination. Someone, or perhaps several families, decided that the permanence of gold, its shine and incorruptibility, could represent authority. This was the beginning of wealth as an idea. The bulldozer in 1972 may have been the agent of chance, but the gold in Grave 43 was no accident. It was deliberate, an intentional statement buried beneath the soil. And in that statement we see the roots of concepts that would later dominate human history: prestige, inequality, property, and the power of symbols. There is a haunting irony here. The man in Grave 43, whoever he was, did not take his wealth with him. It lay undisturbed for millennia until a machine clawed it back into the light. For thousands of years the gold existed as a silent witness, its meaning lost, waiting for us to find it. What we see in it may not be what its makers intended, but the very fact that we search for meaning is part of the continuity of humanity. We are drawn to the shimmer of permanence, even when it comes from a world utterly unlike our own. So how should we think of Varna today? Not as the birthplace of money in the strict sense, because coins and currencies were still far in the future, but as the earliest evidence that humans were beginning to treat objects as carriers of social value beyond mere utility. Gold at Varna was not traded in markets or counted in exchange, but it was displayed in death to communicate power in life. And that may be the first step on the long, winding road toward what we now call money. As humble scholars, we cannot claim to know every detail. We do not know the name of the man in Grave 43. We do not know the precise rituals that surrounded his burial. We do not know if his wealth was earned, inherited, or bestowed. But we do know this. The accident in 1972 gave us a window into a world where inequality had already taken root, and where the concept of wealth was already shaping society. That window reminds us that the origins of money are not just about trade. They are about identity, about status, and about the choices people make to define themselves against others. Perhaps the real haunting question is this: was Grave 43 the beginning of something we still live with today? When we look at those gold ornaments, are we seeing the first glimmer of a system that would grow into empires, banks, and the global flow of trillions every day? Or are we simply seeing one community's fleeting experiment with symbols that, by chance, survived? We may never know for certain. What we can say is that the Varna necropolis marks a moment in human history when gold first became more than metal. It became meaning, and from that meaning the long shadow of wealth began. Let us return to that ancient cemetery by the Black Sea, and this time let us stand before the most unsettling and intriguing of its burials. Imagine crouching beside a grave that has been hidden beneath the soil for 6,500 years. Within it lies the skeleton of a man, his bones still aligned, his body stretched out on its back. Around him, scattered and placed with deliberate care, are objects that change the way we think about the origins of power. This is grave 43 of the Varna necropolis, and it contains more gold than all the other graves combined, over 1.5 kilograms of it. The obvious question is simple. Why? Why was one man buried with such a staggering concentration of wealth when others in the same cemetery were sent into the earth with only a handful of beads, or with nothing at all? Archaeologists often hesitate to call him a king, because king suggests a throne, a palace, and a structured state. Those things did not exist in southeastern Europe in the 5th millennium before our era, but he was certainly someone whose life and death were extraordinary. The objects placed around him include golden sceptres shaped like batons, heavy ornaments that could not have been worn casually, beads and appliques in hundreds, as well as copper tools, stone blades, and finely crafted ceramics. Each item seems to have been chosen for a reason, and together they speak of a role that was more than just economic. One hypothesis, often discussed among scholars, is that this man was not only a leader in material terms, but also in spiritual ones. Some see him as a kind of chief priest, a figure whose authority came not just from control of resources, but from control of ritual. The presence of objects that resemble ceremonial staffs rather than functional tools strengthens this view. The grave includes items that were unlikely to have been used for work or battle. Instead, they may have been symbols meant to show that this man held a position at the centre of his community's cosmology, perhaps mediating between the living and the ancestors, or between humans and the divine. There is another layer to consider. The man's skeleton reveals he was of robust build, likely middle-aged. His bones show wear from physical activity, but also signs that he had lived longer than many in his community. Longevity itself, in a world of uncertain harvests and constant risks, may have given him special status. To live into one's 40s or 50s at that time was rare. To combine age with wealth and with ritual authority may have elevated him into something close to royalty, before the idea of royalty existed. The gold in his grave is striking not only in quantity but in diversity. There are large pieces, such as thick bracelets and heavy pendants, but also tiny beads that would have taken hours upon hours to craft. These small items suggest patient artisanship and a community willing to devote enormous labour to produce objects that had no immediate use in farming, herding, or survival. Gold is soft. It cannot plough fields, fell trees, or cut meat. Its only power lies in what people believe it represents. That belief, clearly, was strong enough that one man was surrounded with over 1,000 carefully made pieces, each gleaming in the dim light of the 5th millennium sun. When we examine the cemetery as a whole, the contrast becomes even sharper. Most burials in Varna are modest. A handful of graves contain small amounts of gold, often in the form of beads or decorations. Many contain none at all. The concentration of wealth in grave 43 is an outlier so extreme that it cannot be ignored. It suggests that this society was already beginning to stratify, to divide into levels of status that were made visible in death. In other words, the Varna necropolis gives us one of the earliest known glimpses of a proto-class system. We must be cautious, of course. The temptation is to map modern concepts of inequality directly onto this ancient community, but the pattern is too consistent to be dismissed. Some individuals were clearly singled out for lavish treatment, while others were not. And this distinction was not random. It was systematic, a reflection of values that the community shared. Grave 43 was not just the resting place of a fortunate individual. It was a performance, a statement carved into the soil, telling all who saw it that hierarchy existed, and that some people were worth more in symbolic terms than others. One detail that fascinates researchers is the presence of objects that look like tools but are made of gold. There are chisels, for example, which could never have been functional. Their softness makes them useless for any real labour, yet their very form suggests the importance of the activity they represent. A golden chisel is not a tool. It is a symbol of craftsmanship elevated to sacred status. It tells us that production itself, the act of shaping materials, had been raised into a domain where it could confer honour and perhaps even power. When we look at these symbolic tools, we might be seeing the first steps toward a society where status was linked not only to control of land or animals, but a control of knowledge and ritual. This was a man who, at least in death, was portrayed as the holder of secrets, the master of codes that others could not access. It is tempting to think of him as the keeper of a system, whether religious, political or economic, that his community had begun to construct. The arrangement of his grave also raises questions about performance in death. The body was placed with care, the ornaments arranged to be visible. Was this funeral a public spectacle? Did members of the community gather to witness the burial, to affirm the man's special role? If so, the grave was not just a resting place but a stage. The objects were props, and the burial itself was a ritual act that reinforced the social order. In that sense, Grave 43 is one of the earliest known theatres of power. It is important to remind ourselves of what we do not know. We do not have written records. We cannot interview the artisans who hammered the gold or the mourners who stood around the pit as the body was lowered in. We cannot say with certainty what the objects meant to them, but we can observe the patterns, and the patterns speak of inequality, of symbolism, and of the birth of hierarchy. The broader implication is sobering. If such distinctions existed already in the 5th millennium BCE Bulgaria, then the roots of social stratification run deeper than many once believed. The Varna necropolis suggests that inequality is not simply a byproduct of states and cities. It may have emerged earlier, in farming communities that were beginning to accumulate surplus and to invest in symbols that mark differences between people. Grave 43, in this view, is not an anomaly. It is an early chapter in a long human story. The invention of classes. The haunting question that lingers is whether the man himself sought this role, or whether it was imposed on him by his community. Did he see himself as special, as chosen, or was he elevated after death, transformed into a symbol regardless of his own intentions? Archaeology can only hint at answers, but the fact that we ask the question tells us something important. Already by 4,500 years before our era, humans were thinking in terms of leaders and followers, sacred and profane, high and low. The man in Grave 43 was not a king in the later sense, but he was certainly a king before kings, a figure whose burial marks the dawn of social hierarchy in Europe. And so we return to that pit in the ground, filled with bones and glittering ornaments. Was it the grave of a leader, a priest, a patriarch, or simply a man whose community decided he was different? We do not know. What we do know is that his death left a message strong enough to survive millennia. Gold as power, wealth as symbol, inequality as performance. From that moment, the trajectory of human society would never be the same. The question we must leave hanging is simple and unsettling. If inequality began this early, was it ever truly avoidable? Imagine walking across the Varna necropolis and coming upon a pit in the earth that glitters with gold, polished copper, finely crafted beads, and symbolic ornaments, and yet contains no bones. These are not robbed graves, nor disturbed burials where the skeleton has been lost to time. They were built this way, intentionally. Archaeologists call them cenotaphs, empty graves, created as if to house someone who never lay there. In Varna, several of the richest collections of gold and artefacts come from such graves without bodies. It forces us to pause and ask, what does it mean to bury treasure without a person? What does it mean to make wealth itself the occupant of a grave? The Varna culture flourished between roughly 4,400 and 4,200 years before our era, and in this time people went to enormous effort to prepare both ordinary burials and these extraordinary empty ones. The richest of the cenotaphs contain golden ornaments, clay vessels, stone tools, and in some cases large numbers of delicate beads. Yet where we would expect a skeleton, there is only soil. Sometimes traces of red ochre, a mineral pigment, are spread across the ground, hinting at the symbolic presence of a body that was never there. The gold, then, is not simply decoration for the dead. It is the dead. Or perhaps it is the idea of the dead. One way to interpret this is to see the cenotaphs as memorials. They may have been graves for individuals who died elsewhere, whose bodies could not be retrieved. In a world without roads or fast transport, death away from home was a permanent absence. By creating an empty grave, the community could still honour the person symbolically, giving them the gold they would have received if their remains had been returned. But this explanation, while plausible, does not fully capture the strangeness of the Varna cenotaphs. For for in some cases the offerings are richer than those placed with actual human remains. That suggests something more than mere substitution. Another interpretation is that these empty graves were ritual acts in themselves, created not to honour a specific absent person, but to embody an idea. In this reading, gold becomes more than personal ornament. It becomes a stand-in for presence, for identity, perhaps even for a soul. To fill a grave with gold and leave it empty of flesh is to declare that value and power are not tied to bodies alone. They exist independently, shimmering and eternal. This would make the cenotaphs some of the earliest evidence we have that wealth was understood symbolically, as a force detached from practical life. The objects placed in these graves reinforce that sense of symbolism. Some resemble masks or faceplates, crafted from thin sheets of gold. These would never have been worn in daily life. They are delicate, ceremonial, and in the absence of a body they take on a haunting quality. A mask without a face is not protection or disguise. It is a declaration that the face itself can be created out of metal. That identity can be forged and buried even when no human lies beneath. Such objects suggest that the people of Varna had already begun to think of gold as carrying something beyond adornment, perhaps even as carrying essence. The use of red ochre adds another layer. This mineral pigment appears across prehistoric burials in Europe and beyond, often interpreted as symbolizing blood, life, or transformation. In Varna's empty graves, ochre spread on the soil may have stood in for the body itself, staining the earth where bones were absent. In this context, the gold and ochre together could have created a kind of surrogate human, a symbolic figure composed of colour and shine rather than flesh and bone. If so, the cenotaphs represent not just wealth, but imagination, the ability to create the illusion of presence through objects. The sheer labour involved in producing and burying these objects should not be underestimated. Gold had to be collected, hammered and polished. Beads had to be drilled and strung. Copper had to be smelted and shaped. All of this required time, skill and coordination. To devote such resources to graves without bodies tells us that the act was deeply meaningful to the community. It was not wasteful display. It was a statement, one that has outlasted millennia. When archaeologists analyse these empty graves, they see an early form of abstraction at work. Wealth here is not serving the living directly. It is not being used to buy food, tools, or protection. Nor is it even marking the status of a known individual in death. It is being buried for its own sake, as if to say, value exists, even without a person to wear it. This abstraction is one of the conceptual steps on the long road to what we now call money. For money, at its core, is a system of abstraction, a way of turning labour, goods, or promises into symbols that can circulate apart from the people who create them. The cenotaphs of Varna are not money in the strict sense, but they may be among the first gestures in that direction. Still, we must be humble in our interpretations. The cenotaphs could mean many things. Perhaps they were dedicated to ancestors whose bodies had long since decayed, leaving only memory. Perhaps they were offerings to unseen powers, meant to secure fertility, protection, or success. Perhaps they were expressions of collective wealth, designed to show outsiders, or even themselves, that this community had resources to spare. What we cannot do is claim certainty. Archaeology rarely gives us that. What it does give us are patterns, and in Varna the pattern is clear. Gold was buried as if it were life itself, even when no life was present. The haunting question that follows is whether these graves represent the beginning of a new way of thinking about wealth, as something that can exist independently, that can be moved, displayed, and buried without needing to attach to a specific person. If so, then the people of Varna were not only crafting beautiful ornaments, they were crafting ideas. Ideas that would echo, in different forms, across millennia of human history. So we stand before a pit of glittering objects, no skeleton in sight, and we are left to wonder, was this a grave for an absent man, or was it a grave for the very concept of wealth itself? It is difficult not to feel uneasy when looking at Varna's graves, where kilograms of gold were buried in the earth while the same people faced the endless challenge of feeding themselves. Did the decision to sink so much wealth into the ground mark a moment of strength, or did it foreshadow collapse? This question has divided archaeologists for decades. For some, the Varna necropolis represents the tragic era of a society that valued wealth display over subsistence. For others, it represents a society whose prosperity was so great that it could afford to treat gold not as a survival tool, but as a symbol, a code, even a measure of order. The Chalcolithic period in southeastern Europe, often called the Copper Age, spanned roughly the 5th millennium before our era. It was a time when farming villages expanded, copper smelting became established, and exchange networks stretched across the Balkans and into the steppe. The people who lived near the shores of the Black Sea cultivated grain, raised livestock, fished, and traded with neighbours. Their settlements were not isolated, they were nodes in a web of interaction. Within this context, the decision to bury gold and copper objects rather than recycle them into daily life must be understood as deliberate. One school of thought argues that this decision was unsustainable. The so-called decline hypothesis views Varna's gold burials as evidence of a society investing in prestige at the expense of resilience. According to this perspective, to hoard or bury gold was to divert labour and skill away from food production, irrigation, or defence. When climate pressures or social upheavals arrived, the argument goes, the community lacked the resources to respond. The necropolis, with its shimmering displays, becomes a kind of monument to overreach, a society collapsing under the weight of its own inequality. Some Bulgarian scholars writing in the later 20th century described Varna culture as decadent, suggesting it vanished because it placed wealth before survival. And yet, this is not the only way to see it. Others, such as Professor Hristo Smolenov, have argued almost the opposite. For him, the gold is not evidence of decline, but of sophistication. Careful measurement of some of the Varna artifacts, he suggests, reveals proportional systems later echoed in Mesopotamian measures and even in the dimensions of Egyptian pyramids. To him, these objects were not waste but repositories of knowledge, a code written in metal, a means of preserving standards of measure and cosmic proportion. In this interpretation, burying gold was less about vanity and more about embedding knowledge in ritual, ensuring its survival across generations. Even without embracing Smolenov's boldest claims, there is evidence that gold in Varna functioned as more than decoration. Many of the objects are standardized in weight and form, as if designed to be compared, counted, or matched. They do not always look like jewellery for everyday wear. Some appear impractical, fragile, or purely symbolic. This suggests that gold may have served as a standard, a way of measuring value, status, or perhaps even agreement. If that is the case, then gold in Varna could represent an early stage in humanity's long experiment with abstract value, what would much later become the domain of money. It is difficult not to feel uneasy when looking at Varna's graves, where kilograms of gold were buried in the earth while the same people faced the endless challenge of feeding themselves. Did the decision to sink so much wealth into the ground mark a moment of strength, or did it foreshadow collapse? This question has divided archaeologists for decades. For some, the Varna necropolis represents the tragic era of a society that valued wealth display over subsistence. For others, it represents a society whose prosperity was so great that it could afford to treat gold not as a survival tool, but as a symbol, a code, even a measure of order. The Chalcolithic period in southeastern Europe, often called the Copper Age, spanned roughly the 5th millennium before our era. It was a time when farming villages expanded, copper smelting became established, and exchange networks stretched across the Balkans and into the steppe. The people who lived near the shores of the Black Sea cultivated grain, raised livestock, fished, and traded with neighbours. Their settlements were not isolated, they were nodes in a web of interaction. Within this context, the decision to bury gold and copper objects rather than recycle them into daily life must be understood as deliberate. One school of thought argues that this decision was unsustainable. The so-called decline hypothesis views Varna's gold burials as evidence of a society investing in prestige at the expense of resilience. According to this perspective, to hoard or bury gold was to divert labour and skill away from food production, irrigation, or defence. When climate pressures or social upheavals arrived, the argument goes, the community lacked the resources to respond. The necropolis, with its shimmering displays, becomes a kind of monument to overreach, a society collapsing under the weight of its own inequality. Some Bulgarian scholars writing in the later 20th century described Varna culture as decadent, suggesting it vanished because it placed wealth before survival. And yet, this is not the only way to see it. Others, such as Professor Hristo Smolenov, have argued almost the opposite. For him, the gold is not evidence of decline, but of sophistication. Careful measurement of some of the Varna artifacts, he suggests, reveals proportional systems later echoed in Mesopotamian measures and even in the dimensions of Egyptian pyramids. To him, these objects were not waste but repositories of knowledge, a code written in metal, a means of preserving standards of measure and cosmic proportion. In this interpretation, burying gold was less about vanity and more about embedding knowledge in ritual, ensuring its survival across generations. Even without embracing Smolenov's boldest claims, there is evidence that gold in Varna functioned as more than decoration. Many of the objects are standardized in weight and form, as if designed to be compared, counted, or matched. They do not always look like jewellery for everyday wear. Some appear impractical, fragile, or purely symbolic. This suggests that gold may have served as a standard, a way of measuring value, status, or perhaps even agreement. If that is the case, then gold in Varna could represent an early stage in humanity's long experiment with abstract value, what would much later become the domain of money. It is one thing to bury gold for display, but quite another to shape it in ways that seem to carry mathematical precision. At Varna, archaeologists have noted that certain artifacts appear standardized in weight and proportion. Thin sheets of hammered gold, small plaques, and carefully worked ornaments often fall into ratios that suggest deliberate measurement rather than chance. This raises a startling question. Were the people who lived on the western shores of the Black Sea in the 5th millennium before our era simply making jewellery, or were they encoding a system of measure, a kind of early standard against which the world itself could be reckoned? The idea has been most strongly put forward by Professor Hristo Smolenov, who has argued that the dimensions of Varna's gold objects reveal underlying mathematical patterns. Using modern measuring techniques, he claims to have found consistent ratios that correspond to what he calls cosmic or planetary proportions. To Smolenov, these artifacts were not trivial ornaments but expressions of a hidden order, a code that carried knowledge of universal constants. He even suggests that what later became known as sacred units of measure may have first been articulated here, long before more familiar centres of ancient civilization arose elsewhere. Mainstream archaeologists, however, are cautious. Most prefer to see the gold as symbols of rank, prestige, or ritual, without invoking cosmic systems. It is always tempting, they point out, to find patterns in numbers once we begin to look for them. Human beings are gifted at pattern recognition, sometimes to the point of overreach. And yet, the persistence of certain weights and sizes across Varna's grave goods is difficult to dismiss. Why would so many objects conform to narrow ranges if not to signal order, regularity, or shared standards? The possibility that these were measures of value, whether of metal, labour, or status, cannot be ruled out. Consider the simplest fact. Gold itself is not useful for survival. It is not eaten. It does not cut wood. It cannot plough a field. Its only strength lies in its durability, malleability, and brilliance. To choose gold as a material for burial already implies an appreciation of its symbolic power. To shape it into standardized forms adds another layer, one that suggests system rather than improvisation. Some plaques resemble scales or ingots, as though meant to be compared by weight. Others seem designed to be worn as badges of office, their sizes echoing each other with subtle consistency. This kind of repetition is not typical of mere ornament. What then were the people of Varna measuring? Some argue that these objects served as early units of account, ways of stabilizing exchange in a world where trade was expanding. Copper was being smelted, salt was traded from the inland mines, obsidian and flint travelled from distant sources. In such a context, to have a standard weight or unit of comparison would have been valuable. Perhaps the gold plaques were not money as we think of it, but benchmarks, counters against which other goods could be measured. In this way, gold may have been the silent partner of exchange, not circulating itself but underpinning the very idea of equivalence. Smolenov pushes further, suggesting that the proportions of Varna's artifacts resonate with larger cosmic patterns. He sees in them echoes of planetary motion, astronomical cycles, and mathematical constants. According to his interpretation, the gold was not only a tool of trade or status, but a bridge between human society and the universe. In his writings, he goes so far as to say that the sacred measure later used in monumental architecture had its origins on the shores of the Black Sea, encoded in these early treasures. Whether one finds this persuasive depends on how one balances imagination and evidence. The truth is that archaeology rarely allows us certainty in matters of intention. A standardized plaque may have been meant to weigh grain, or it may have been designed to echo cosmological beliefs. A series of ratios may represent cosmic order, or they may be coincidences produced by artisans working within practical constraints. What matters is that the Varna material is sufficiently rich to sustain both interpretations. It invites us to consider that humans in the 5th millennium before our era were already grappling with abstract ideas of order, equivalence, and value. What makes this so striking is the time depth. Varna predates the first known written records by millennia. It comes before the well-documented states of Mesopotamia and Egypt. Yet here we find people experimenting with gold, not only as ornament but perhaps as measure, perhaps as code. If true, this would push back the history of systematic value by thousands of years. Even if Smolanov's cosmic reading is set aside, the simple act of standardizing objects implies a desire for order beyond the immediate. It implies a willingness to bind society together with abstract principles, not only personal adornment. To speak humbly, we cannot say with certainty that Varna invented a gold standard in the sense we would later recognize. The evidence is too fragmentary, the context too distant. But we can say that something unusual was happening here. Gold was not being left in random shapes. It was being worked with care, weighed, balanced, and repeated. That repetition, that standardization, is a seed of the very idea of measurement. Whether it was meant to measure grain, social rank, or the cosmos itself, it points to a people who sought order beyond the daily struggle, and so we are left with a haunting question. Were the people of Varna quietly inventing the world's first standard of value, a kind of proto-gold standard millennia before history gives us coins and weights? Or are we, in our search for origins, reading too much into patterns that meant something different to them altogether? We cannot be sure. What we can say is that Varna's gold, hammered into precise forms, represents one of the earliest known attempts to make value tangible, measurable, and enduring, and that alone is a revelation worth pausing over. Long before the first pharaoh raised his crown over the Nile, and long before stone was pulled into place to form the first pyramids, communities on the shores of the Black Sea were already experimenting with metals, symbols of power, and the social hierarchies that would later define civilizations elsewhere. The Varna necropolis on the Bulgarian coast dates to around the middle of the 5th millennium before our era, centuries older than the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt and older still than the rise of the first monumental cities in Mesopotamia. This raises a question both enticing and difficult. Could the patterns of society seen at Varna have influenced or prefigured those later civilizations, or were they separate experiments in the shared human search for order and meaning? Archaeology has revealed that the Balkans and Lower Danube basin were not isolated during this time. The copper-rich mountains of the Carpathians fed raw materials into networks that stretched into the steppe, across Anatolia, and toward the eastern Mediterranean. Salt from mines in present-day Romania, and gold from riverbeds in the Bulgarian highlands, were moved through exchange systems that were both regional and long-distance. While writing had not yet appeared, the circulation of objects tells its own kind of story. Small figurines, polished stone axes, and ornaments made their way across cultures, testifying to a level of contact that should not be underestimated. When we compare this with Egypt in the same broad time frame, we find societies on parallel but not identical trajectories. In the centuries before 3000 before our era, communities along the Nile were also organising into more stratified forms, recognisable in cemeteries, where some individuals were buried with rich grave goods while others were not. Elite tombs at sites like Hierakonpolis contain objects of copper, ivory and exotic materials, not unlike the contrast between rich and poor graves at Varna. Yet the Egyptian trajectory led towards centralised kingship and monumental architecture, while the Balkan Danube cultures eventually declined, their tells abandoned and their metallurgical traditions fading. In Mesopotamia, The Uruk period likewise unfolded during the 4th millennium before our era, marked by the rise of large urban centres, monumental temples, and the first known writing systems. There too, wealth differentiation is visible in both architecture and burial. But where the Sumerians left texts and massive mud brick structures, the people of Varna left a silent field of graves, their voices preserved only in the gold and copper they carried into the earth. The question becomes not whether there was direct contact, which is hard to prove, but whether similar forces, surplus production, control of resources, long-distance trade, and the human tendency to codify difference, were driving parallel experiments. Theories of influence between these regions have long attracted scholars. Some argue that the metallurgical knowledge visible in southeastern Europe spread toward Anatolia and then into the Near East, providing foundations for later bronze-working traditions. Others caution against such linear models, emphasizing instead that multiple regions could discover similar techniques independently, given access to ore and fire. The Balkan cultures show some of the earliest evidence of copper smelting predating the large-scale bronze industries of Mesopotamia. But whether this knowledge travelled is a question we cannot yet answer. What is more certain is that ideas of prestige and power attached to rare materials were emerging in several parts of the world simultaneously. In Egypt, gold would later become the quintessential symbol of divine authority, associated with the flesh of the gods. In Mesopotamia, temples accumulated precious metals as offerings to deities, storing them as both wealth and sacred trust. At Varna, long before these traditions crystallized, gold was already a marker of distinction, wrapped around bodies and buried in empty cenotaphs. This parallel does not prove contact, but it reminds us that human beings across wide distances often converged on similar symbolic uses for the same materials. We should also note the geography. The Black Sea region sits at a crossroads between Europe and Asia, between the steppe and the Mediterranean. Rivers such as the Danube provided natural corridors for movement, while the coast opened routes toward Anatolia. In later millennia, these pathways would channel Indo-European migrations, Greek colonization, and countless episodes of contact. It is reasonable to imagine that even in the 5th and 4th millennia before our era, people, objects, and ideas were travelling along these same routes. If so, then the cultural experiments at Varna did not remain hidden, but may have been glimpsed, however briefly, by neighbours who carried stories further. One intriguing comparison lies in the treatment of the dead. At Varna, the rich graves with gold and copper tools suggest not only social ranking, but possibly ritual roles, perhaps chiefs or priestly figures. In pre-dynastic Egypt, the emergence of elite cemeteries likewise signalled the rising importance of leadership, with certain individuals marked as special through their burials. The difference is that in Egypt, these roles expanded into formal kingship, while in southeastern Europe the system faltered. This contrast invites reflection. Why did one region move toward enduring statehood, while another receded into obscurity? Was it ecological, with the Nile providing unmatched agricultural stability? Was it geopolitical, with the Nile Valley easier to defend and control than the open plains of the Balkans? Or was it simply historical contingency, the unpredictable path of human choice? Another dimension is the question of symbolism. At Varna, some scholars suggest that gold may have carried meanings beyond status, perhaps encoding measures or cosmological ideas. In Egypt, cosmology would be woven tightly into political authority, with rulers presented as intermediaries between heaven and earth. If Varna's gold did indeed embody notions of order, then it stands as a precursor to the blending of cosmology and power that would later become explicit in pharaonic ideology. Again, we must be careful not to leap to conclusions, but the resonance is difficult to ignore. What does all of this mean for our understanding of early civilization? At the very least, Varna demonstrates that the roots of social stratification, symbolic wealth, and organised burial stretch back earlier and spread wider than the traditional centres of Mesopotamia and Egypt. Civilization did not emerge in a single place and radiate outward like light from a lamp. Instead, multiple regions were experimenting with complex social forms, some of which flourished and some of which withered. To place Varna alongside pre-dynastic Egypt and Uruk is to see a mosaic of human creativity, not a linear progression. And so, we are left with a haunting possibility. Could the people who buried their dead with gold by the Black Sea have whispered into the deep currents of human history, their practices echoing faintly in the rise of the later civilizations? Or were they a brilliant but isolated experiment, a flicker of complexity that burned brightly and then faded, leaving others to carry forward the torch? We cannot know for certain. What we can say is that before pharaohs and before pyramids, there were already kings without thrones and standards without empires, quietly shaping the possibilities of what humanity could become. When did humans first decide that some lives were worth more than others? It is a question that does not lead to a single site or a single moment, but the graves at Varna along the western coast of the Black Sea offer some of the clearest early evidence. In the 5th millennium before our era, a community chose to bury one man with more than a kilogram of gold, while others were placed in the same cemetery with little or nothing. That choice alone suggests that wealth and power were not shared equally. But inequality is more than a matter of gold objects. It is a pattern of how societies organise themselves, and in this period of Chalcolithic Europe, we begin to see its earliest layers forming. Archaeology across southeastern Europe points to a gradual but undeniable rise in differentiation between people. The Varna graves are striking because of their contrast, yet they are not alone. At Drancolac, another cemetery site on the Bulgarian coast, hundreds of burials reveal differences in grave goods, suggesting that some people had greater access to ornaments and tools than others. Farther north, the Cucuteni Tripelia culture built immense settlements on the forest steppe of present-day Romania, Moldova and Ukraine, with some communities numbering tens of thousands of inhabitants. Within these settlements, houses varied in size and contents, hinting that status differences existed even within tightly packed neighbourhoods. What unites these examples is that people were beginning to sort themselves into social categories, and those categories were recognised in death as much as in life. Why did this happen in the 5th millennium before our era? One explanation rests in the changing nature of labour. Farming, which had already spread into Europe millennia earlier, reached a level of intensity where surpluses could be generated. These surpluses allowed certain individuals to specialise in activities beyond subsistence. Some became full-time artisans, crafting ceramics, weaving textiles, or shaping ornaments. Others worked with the new and dangerous technology of metallurgy, smelting copper from ore and casting it into tools or prestige objects. These specialists required support from the wider community, which meant that some households or individuals were producing enough to feed not only themselves but also others. Once this division of labour took root, it created room for differential power. Those who controlled surplus could also control relationships. Metallurgy in particular deserves attention. The ability to extract copper and gold from the earth required both knowledge and access. Ores were located in specific regions, such as the Balkans and Carpathians, meaning that communities near these sources could command influence. The people who mastered smelting and hammering metals were few, and their skills could be guarded as secrets. This exclusivity magnified inequality, because possession of metal tools or ornaments set certain individuals apart. At Varna, the appearance of copper axes and chisels in rich graves suggests not only practical utility but symbolic weight. They may have been badges of authority as much as working instruments. To hold a tool that no one else could make was to signal a special place in society. Craft specialization extended beyond metals. The Cucuteni Tripelia settlements are renowned for their intricately painted pottery, produced at scales that suggest dedicated artisans. Some researchers believe that ceramic production was centralized, with certain workshops supplying entire communities. If so, then artisans would have occupied privileged roles, supported by the redistribution of food and materials. The architecture of these settlements also hints at hierarchy. Some houses were larger, with more elaborate hearths or storage features, while others were smaller and simpler. These differences are subtle compared to later palaces and temples, but in their own time they marked an emerging spectrum of wealth and status. Burial practices provide one of the clearest windows into inequality, because they capture community decisions about who deserved what in death. At Varna, the richest burials contained not only gold and copper, but also finely crafted flint blades, jewellery of exotic stones, and ornaments of imported shells. The poorest contained only the body itself, sometimes with a modest ceramic vessel. This stark contrast suggests that some individuals were considered far more important than others, and that this importance was acknowledged by the community at large. Whether this reflected lifetime power, ritual authority, or familial status is debated, but the message of inequality is unmistakable. It is worth noting that inequality does not necessarily imply kings or formal rulers. In the 5th millennium before our era, these societies were still relatively small scale, lacking the massive cities of later civilizations. The inequality of Varna or Cucuteni Tripilia may have taken the form of lineage heads, ritual leaders, or wealthy households rather than monarchs. Yet even without crowns or thrones, these early elites held real influence. They could command labour for their burial rights, accumulate ornaments, and pass on wealth through generations. In this sense, they were the first to step onto a path that would eventually lead to kings, empires, and the stratified worlds we know from later history. How did ordinary people respond to this growing inequality? That is harder to know. Archaeology shows us the outcomes, who was buried with gold, who was not, but it does not capture dissent or acceptance. It is possible that communities viewed these distinctions as natural, tied to ritual or spiritual roles that gave meaning to the group. It is equally possible that inequality generated tensions, with some families resenting the power of others. In large Cucuteni Tripilia settlements, where thousands of people lived in close quarters, managing differences must have been a constant challenge. Whether through cooperation or conflict, these early experiments in hierarchy set the stage for the more formalized stratification that would follow in later millennia. One important element in this story is that inequality was not uniform across regions. In some parts of Europe, burials remained relatively egalitarian, with few grave goods even in wealthier communities. In others, like the Balkans, the contrasts were extreme. This suggests that inequality was not an inevitable outcome of farming or metallurgy, but a social choice. Different communities experimented with different ways of organizing themselves, some leaning toward shared distribution, others toward concentrated power. Varna, with its glittering graves, represents one of the clearest examples of the latter choice. The haunting question is whether inequality strengthened or weakened these societies. Did elites help to coordinate labour, trade, and ritual, making communities more resilient? Or did they siphon off resources, burdening the majority and leaving societies vulnerable to collapse? Varna itself declined by the end of the 5th millennium before our era, its cemetery falling silent and its traditions fading. The Cucuteni Tripilia megasites were eventually abandoned as well. Perhaps inequality contributed to their fragility. Or perhaps it was climate, migration, or sheer chance. As humble students of the past, we must admit that we do not know. What we can say is that by the 5th millennium before our era, humanity had crossed an invisible threshold. No longer were all members of a community treated equally in life or in death. Some were elevated, adorned with gold and copper, while others were left with little. This was the first inequality, fragile yet real, a pattern that would echo through countless generations. And we are left to ask, once a society decides that some lives are worth more than others, can it ever truly go back? If you lived in a world without coins, markets, or banks, how did you pay your debts? The answer is that you probably never thought of it in those terms, at least not the way we do now. Long before coins, contracts, and ledgers, people exchanged things in webs of trust, memory, and obligation. In the Upper Paleolithic, stretching roughly from 40,000 to 10,000 years ago, humans were already navigating complex social landscapes, bound together by shared hunts, gifts, and mutual aid. In such worlds, what we might call money did not yet exist, but the roots of money were already forming in something more basic, the memory of who owed what, and the social expectation that debts would one day be repaid. Anthropologists like Chapuruka Kusimba have emphasized that debt is older than money, and that gift exchange lies at the core of human cooperation. In small bands of hunter-gatherers, sharing was not optional but essential. A large animal once killed could not be stored for long, so it was distributed among the group. The hunter did not become rich from hoarding. Instead, he gained prestige from generosity. Others would remember his contribution, and later, when the roles were reversed, they would reciprocate. This was not barter in the sense of trading a spearhead for a hide on the spot. It was an economy of memory, where social ties were reinforced through repeated acts of giving and receiving. The idea of reciprocity shaped everything. Gifts were rarely free. They carried with them an invisible obligation. Anthropologist Marcel Mauss famously called this the spirit of the gift, the sense that giving creates a bond that demands return. Among hunter-gatherers and early farmers, this spirit ensured cooperation in uncertain environments. If you shared meat today, you could count on others to share with you tomorrow. Debt in this sense was not recorded on paper or stone, but inscribed in the minds of community members. Forgetting to repay could mean losing trust, and in small groups where survival depended on collaboration, that could be disastrous. As human groups became more sedentary in the Neolithic period, beginning around 10,000 years ago, the forms of exchange grew more elaborate. Farming communities produced surpluses of grain, livestock, or crafted goods, and these too circulated through networks of gifts and obligations. Archaeologists find evidence of exotic materials moving long distances in this period. Obsidian blades from Anatolia appearing in the Levant, or seashells from the Mediterranean found far inland. Such exchanges likely occurred not through impersonal markets, but through reciprocal relationships. A community might gift obsidian blades to another, expecting in return livestock, textiles, or future support. These were the foundations of trade routes, but the logic was still rooted in reciprocity rather than profit. What made this system work was memory. People remembered who had been generous and who had been stingy. Oral traditions and reputations served as ledgers long before writing. This social accounting was often enforced through ritual. Ceremonies, feasts, or marriages could formalize obligations, with witnesses ensuring that debts were recognized. A feast, for example, might be hosted by a family that slaughtered many animals, feeding the whole community. In return, that family would gain prestige and the expectation that others would support them in times of need. The feast itself was not simply food. It was a statement of wealth and a creation of debt. We can see the endurance of this system in practices that persisted well into historical times. Tally sticks, used in medieval Europe, were simple pieces of wood notched to record debts. They might look primitive compared to coins or ledgers, but they reflect the same principle, a shared recognition of obligation that could be recalled and settled later. In the Neolithic, there may not have been sticks or ledgers, but the principle was the same. The community itself was the book of accounts. Each member carried knowledge of what was owed, and gossip or collective memory ensured accountability. Anthropological studies of modern traditional societies provide analogies that help us imagine this ancient economy. Among the Trobriand islanders, the cooler ring involved the exchange of shell valuables across vast distances. These items circulated endlessly, not because they were useful in themselves, but because they created relationships. To receive a cooler shell was to accept an obligation to pass it on, to host, to gift in return. The wealth lay not in possession, but in participation. Similar patterns appear among pastoralists, where livestock exchanges cement alliances, or in potlatch ceremonies among indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest, where chiefs demonstrated status by giving away vast amounts of goods. Though separated by time and place, these examples show the deep human tendency to create systems of wealth grounded in reciprocity. Returning to the Upper Paleolithic and Neolithic, one can imagine that what looked like mere sharing was in fact the scaffolding of economic life. A flint tool passed from one group to another, a necklace of shells given to a bride, or a portion of grain gifted to a neighbour in a poor harvest. All of these carried obligations. To us they may look like small acts of generosity, but to those who lived them, they were threads in the web of social survival. If money is at its core a way to track obligations, then these webs were the earliest forms of accounting. It is important to emphasise what this was not. It was not barter, in the classic sense of a pig traded directly for a bushel of wheat. The idea that early economies were purely barter-based is largely a myth, popularised in modern economics but unsupported by ethnography. Instead, people relied on ongoing relationships where debts and credits flowed across time. The immediacy of barter was too brittle for real societies. What mattered was the flexibility of gift economies, where value was not just in the thing exchanged but in the bond created. The haunting question is what it felt like to live in such a world. To know that your obligations were remembered, not written down, and that your reputation was your credit. To share meat and hope that others would remember your hunger tomorrow. To give a daughter in marriage and trust that her new family would one day support yours. These are not the ledgers of banks, but they are the ledgers of humanity's deep past. And here lies the paradox. Before money had a name, before coins or credit, the logic of debt was already shaping us. Our species survived because we trusted others to remember what was owed and to act on it. These invisible bonds were the first economy, as fragile as memory yet as enduring as culture itself. We may never know exactly how Paleolithic hunters tallied their debts, or how Neolithic farmers balanced their exchanges, but we can say with some confidence that money did not appear from nowhere. It grew from the gift, from reciprocity, from the unspoken obligation that when someone gave to you, you would one day give back. And perhaps the most haunting question is whether we have ever truly left that world behind. Why did shells, objects so small and seemingly fragile, become more valuable than food in many parts of the ancient world? To us today, the idea might sound strange. After all, you cannot eat a shell, you cannot build a shelter with it, and yet for thousands of years people across Africa, Asia and Oceania prized shells above almost anything else. They were worn, traded, buried and eventually recognised as one of the world's first global currencies. The mystery is not why shells were beautiful, they are of course, but why they came to hold such enduring symbolic and economic power, so much so that they outlasted empires, crossed oceans and left traces in the earliest economies we can reconstruct. The story begins deep in prehistory. Archaeological evidence suggests that as far back as 9,000 years ago, shells were being used in ways that hint at proto-currency. Cowrie shells in particular, small and glossy with their distinctive slit-like opening, appear again and again. They were gathered from the sea and transported far inland, showing that people valued them enough to carry them across great distances. Unlike food or tools, shells did not serve immediate practical needs. They did not spoil, they were easy to transport, and their rarity gave them a kind of built-in scarcity. In a way, they already contained the qualities that later societies would prize in money: durability, portability, and a perception of limited supply. By the time of the Neolithic farming societies, shells were circulating not just as ornaments, but as items of social and economic weight. Archaeologists have found shell beads and necklaces buried with the dead, sometimes in places where such shells could not have been collected locally. This suggests that they were traded or gifted across networks spanning long distances. The act of burying shells with the dead also signals that they were more than decoration. They had symbolic value, perhaps marking status, wealth, or spiritual protection. Already, shells were standing in for concepts larger than themselves. The dominance of cowries is particularly striking. Their smooth, polished surface and small size made them ideal for handling, counting, and stringing. In many ways, they functioned like the first standardized tokens. When strung together in long lines, they could be transported in bulk. When counted individually, they could serve as small units of value. Across Africa and Asia, cowries became the object through which debts, marriages, and even punishments were negotiated. This was not barter, where one exchanged grain for cloth. This was something closer to a unit of account, a proto-money that simplified transactions across communities that did not share the same goods or resources. In China, cowrie shells appear prominently in archaeological sites from the Neolithic and early dynastic periods. They were used in rituals, buried in tombs, and later even imitated in bronze to serve as money-like objects when shells themselves were scarce. The Chinese word for money retains a linguistic echo of this deep history. The character for currency originally incorporated the image of a cowrie shell. This is a remarkable testament to how deeply shells imprinted themselves on the human imagination as symbols of value. In Africa, the use of shells as currency continued for millennia, in some regions persisting well into the historic era. Cowries were imported in vast numbers along trade routes, particularly through the Indian Ocean trade networks. They became central to markets in West Africa, where they circulated alongside other forms of wealth such as iron tools, textiles and livestock. At their peak, they served as the dominant currency in parts of Africa, regulating exchanges from small purchases to large political transactions. Shells were counted by the dozens, the hundreds, and even the thousands, much like coins or bills today. For many, they represented the very idea of money itself. The symbolic power of shells extended beyond economic exchange. In Oceania, shells were woven into complex systems of ritual and prestige. The Kula ring, an exchange system among the Trobriand islanders, involved the circulation of shell valuables over great distances. These shells were not consumed or kept permanently. Instead, they were passed along, creating relationships of obligation and alliance. Each transfer reinforced bonds between groups and individuals. The shells were the medium through which trust and status circulated, functioning not only as currency, but as markers of social fabric. What made shells so resilient as a medium of value was their dual nature. They were at once natural and symbolic. They came from the sea, evoking mystery and distance, yet they could be counted and standardized. They were portable and durable, but they also glittered in a way that appealed to human senses. Their beauty made them desirable, their scarcity made them rare, and their portability made them practical. Unlike grain, which could rot, or livestock, which could die, shells endured. They could move across deserts, up rivers, through mountains, and still retain their value when they arrived. Some scholars have suggested that the use of shells as money tells us something fundamental about how humans think about value. It is not only utility that defines worth. Value is often created through shared belief, through collective recognition that something counts. A shell could not feed a village, but if the village agreed that shells represented obligations or wealth, then they became indispensable. This collective fiction, if we want to call it that, is the same logic that sustains modern currencies. A banknote itself is just paper, but its power comes from shared agreement. In that sense, shells represent the first great experiment in the shared imagination of value. There is also a darker side to this history. In later centuries, shells were imported by the millions into Africa as part of the transoceanic trade, including the slave trade. Cowries became entangled with systems of exploitation, demonstrating how something once prized as a symbol of reciprocity and community could be weaponized within global commerce. While this lies far outside the Neolithic roots of shell money, it shows how durable the logic of shells was, capable of adapting to different scales of exchange and different moral worlds. If we return to the earliest evidence of shells in burials and exchanges, one haunting question emerges. Did people see them as wealth, or as symbols of something deeper? Were they tokens of beauty, charms against misfortune, or literal units of account? The truth is that they were likely all of these at once. For some, they might have represented spiritual protection. For others, prestige. For still others, a way of measuring obligations. What we can say is that shells allowed people to move beyond direct exchange, and to create systems of value that travelled across time and space. In the end, shells remind us that money was never simply about practicality. It was about trust, beauty, scarcity, and shared belief. Long before coins were struck or ledgers inscribed, long before markets became global in the modern sense, shells were already connecting communities, binding people through invisible debts, and shaping what it meant to be rich, powerful, or respected. The mystery of why shells mattered more than food has no single answer, but perhaps that is the point. Food satisfies hunger for a day, but shells satisfied something deeper, the human need to create meaning, to establish order, and to recognize value in what endures. And perhaps the most humbling thought is that in some ways we're still doing the same thing today, only with different tokens. Would you buy bread with a cow? At first, the question feels absurd, but in the deep past of human economies, such a trade was not only imaginable, but perfectly sensible. Long before coins, banknotes, or electronic transfers, wealth was measured in things that lived, things that could be consumed, and things that could be carried. Cattle, salt, obsidian, copper ingots, all of these became forms of what anthropologists call commodity money. They were practical, tangible, and valuable in themselves. But they also came with profound limitations, and it was precisely those limitations that pushed human societies to imagine systems that would one day become more standardized. The story begins with animals. Domesticated livestock were among the first forms of wealth that could move between households and communities. Cows, goats, and sheep were not just food sources. They reproduced, provided milk, pulled ploughs, and offered hides for clothing. They embodied wealth in a way that grain or stone could not. A cow was a renewable resource, a walking store of value. In early Neolithic societies, especially from around 9,000 years ago, cattle became a central measure of status and exchange. To give someone a cow was to provide them with long-term security. To receive cattle as bride wealth or tribute was to enhance one's standing. In many Indo-European languages, words for money and cattle share the same root, reminding us that the connection between animals and wealth was not symbolic but literal. Yet there is an obvious problem. You cannot divide a cow into smaller units without destroying its value as a living animal. A sheep might be worth less than a cow, but even then livestock are not divisible in the way a transaction might require. If you wanted to pay a neighbour for a small service or a sack of grain, offering a whole animal would be excessive. Animals also die, fall ill or wander off, making them an unreliable store of value over time. For all their importance, livestock lacked the flexibility required for a system of exchange that could scale beyond households or ritualized agreements. This is where other commodities entered the story. Salt, for instance, became one of the most widely valued goods in prehistoric and ancient economies. Essential for preserving food and sustaining life, salt had both practical utility and symbolic weight. Communities that controlled salt sources could command trade routes and exert influence over neighbours. Blocks of salt or carefully measured portions were exchanged as units of value. Salt's durability and divisibility made it far more manageable than cattle for daily exchange. To pay someone in salt was to provide them with a resource that could be stored, consumed, or traded again. The word salary in later languages would preserve this memory, though the practice stretches back long before recorded history. Other materials held similar roles in different regions. Obsidian, the volcanic glass prized for its sharpness and beauty, was traded across vast distances from as early as 9,000 years ago. Archaeological evidence shows obsidian tools and blades moving from their source regions in Anatolia, the Caucasus, and East Africa into communities hundreds of kilometres away. To possess obsidian was to hold both practical cutting power and a rare commodity, something that marked status and facilitated exchange. Unlike cattle, obsidian could be broken into smaller pieces and distributed, but its value depended on scarcity. When sources were common or new deposits discovered, its function as proto-money diminished. Copper ingots tell yet another chapter. In the 5th and 4th millennia before the Common Era, as metallurgy spread through parts of Europe and the Near East, copper was not just shaped into tools, but also into standardized forms. In some regions, large oxide-shaped copper ingots, flat, heavy slabs resembling stretched animal hides, became recognizable stores of value. Their form allowed them to be stacked, transported, and measured. They carried an abstract quality closer to what we later think of as currency. But here again was a problem. They were extremely heavy, not practical for small transactions, and required large-scale mining and smelting infrastructure to produce. Only societies with sufficient organization could maintain them, limiting their reach. Would you buy bread with a cow? At first, the question feels absurd, but in the deep past of human economies, such a trade was not only imaginable, but perfectly sensible. Long before coins, banknotes, or electronic transfers, wealth was measured in things that lived, things that could be consumed, and things that could be carried. Cattle, salt, obsidian, copper ingots, all of these became forms of what anthropologists call commodity money. They were practical, tangible, and valuable in themselves. But they also came with profound limitations, and it was precisely those limitations that pushed human societies to imagine systems that would one day become more standardized. The story begins with animals. Domesticated livestock were among the first forms of wealth that could move between households and communities. Cows, goats, and sheep were not just food sources. They reproduced, provided milk, pulled ploughs, and offered hides for clothing. They embodied wealth in a way that grain or stone could not. A cow was a renewable resource, a walking store of value. In early Neolithic societies, especially from around 9,000 years ago, cattle became a central measure of status and exchange. To give someone a cow was to provide them with long-term security. To receive cattle as bride wealth or tribute was to enhance one's standing. In many Indo-European languages, words for money and cattle share the same root, reminding us that the connection between animals and wealth was not symbolic but literal. Yet there is an obvious problem. You cannot divide a cow into smaller units without destroying its value as a living animal. A sheep might be worth less than a cow, but even then livestock are not divisible in the way a transaction might require. If you wanted to pay a neighbour for a small service or a sack of grain, offering a whole animal would be excessive. Animals also die, fall ill or wander off, making them an unreliable store of value over time. For all their importance, livestock lacked the flexibility required for a system of exchange that could scale beyond households or ritualized agreements. This is where other commodities entered the story. Salt, for instance, became one of the most widely valued goods in prehistoric and ancient economies. Essential for preserving food and sustaining life, salt had both practical utility and symbolic weight. Communities that controlled salt sources could command trade routes and exert influence over neighbours. Blocks of salt or carefully measured portions were exchanged as units of value. Salt's durability and divisibility made it far more manageable than cattle for daily exchange. To pay someone in salt was to provide them with a resource that could be stored, consumed, or traded again. The word salary in later languages would preserve this memory, though the practice stretches back long before recorded history. Other materials held similar roles in different regions. Obsidian, the volcanic glass prized for its sharpness and beauty, was traded across vast distances from as early as 9,000 years ago. Archaeological evidence shows obsidian tools and blades moving from their source regions in Anatolia, the Caucasus, and East Africa into communities hundreds of kilometres away. To possess obsidian was to hold both practical cutting power and a rare commodity, something that marked status and facilitated exchange. Unlike cattle, obsidian could be broken into smaller pieces and distributed, but its value depended on scarcity. When sources were common or new deposits discovered, its function as proto-money diminished. Copper ingots tell yet another chapter. In the 5th and 4th millennia before the Common Era, as metallurgy spread through parts of Europe and the Near East, copper was not just shaped into tools, but also into standardized forms. In some regions, large oxide-shaped copper ingots, flat, heavy slabs resembling stretched animal hides, became recognizable stores of value. Their form allowed them to be stacked, transported, and measured. They carried an abstract quality closer to what we later think of as currency. But here again was a problem. They were extremely heavy, not practical for small transactions, and required large-scale mining and smelting infrastructure to produce. Only societies with sufficient organization could maintain them, limiting their reach. Why was the first currency not a coin you could hold, but a weight of silver you often never even saw? The story of money in Mesopotamia does not begin with gleaming discs stamped with rulers' heads, but with accounts, with obligations, with promises recorded in clay. Around 5,000 years ago, in the river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, people began to measure debt in units that became known as the shekel. A shekel was not originally a coin, but a weight, roughly 8.5 grams of silver, used to calculate what was owed. And this distinction matters because it tells us that the earliest money was not about exchange in a market, but about recording relationships of credit and obligation. The context here is essential. Mesopotamia in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era was a world of city-states rising from irrigated fields, each clustered around temples that dominated not only religion, but also economy. These temples controlled vast agricultural estates, herds, workshops, and labour forces. They stored grain, distributed rations, and managed trade. They were in effect the first institutions large enough to require complex accounting systems. The clay tablets that survive from this era are filled not with epic poetry or royal decrees, but with lists, deliveries of barley, distributions of beer, quantities of wool, obligations of workers. In such a system, money was not primarily a medium of exchange in daily life. It was a unit of account, a way to standardize value across goods and services. Silver emerged as the reference point, not because everyone used silver directly, but because it provided a stable unit against which obligations could be measured. A worker's wages, a tenant's rent, a merchant's debt, all could be expressed in shekels of silver, whether or not silver actually changed hands. Archaeologists studying cuneiform tablets have found thousands of references to shekels, many of which clearly describe debts or obligations to be settled in goods rather than metal. A labourer might be owed a fraction of a shekel for work, paid not in silver but in barley, beer or oil. The shekel created a common denominator, a way to compare and record. This suggests that money, at least in its earliest Mesopotamian form, was not born out of barter. The old story that people first swapped cows for grain until they realised they needed coins does not align with what the tablets show. Instead, people first built systems of credit and debt, and only later materialised these in objects we now call money. The shekel was an abstraction before it was ever a coin. The temple's role in this cannot be overstated. By acting as central authorities, temples provided trust and continuity. They issued rations to workers, recorded loans to farmers, and mediated trade. When a farmer borrowed seed grain, the debt was calculated in shekels, with the understanding that repayment might be made in kind at harvest. When merchants engaged in long-distance trade, their contracts recorded values in shekels, even if goods themselves were exchanged directly. The shekel anchored these systems in a language of weight and value that could be carried across communities. But there was also tension. Silver had to be acquired, usually through trade with regions that had mines, and that made it scarce within Mesopotamia itself. As a result, the shekel's role as a unit of account was far larger than its role as a medium of exchange. Many people probably went their entire lives without handling actual silver, yet debts and obligations in silver governed their economic reality. The shekel functioned as an invisible money, one that existed primarily in records and expectations. The ration system illustrates this clearly. Workers employed by temples or palaces often received wages not in silver, but in daily or monthly rations of barley, beer and oil. Yet those rations were calculated in shekel equivalents. In other words, the shekel told administrators how much labour was worth, how much food should be given, how obligations added up. Here, money was not about shopping in a market, but about ensuring that the immense machinery of temple economy could keep moving. We also see in these systems the beginnings of interest, of structured debt that extended beyond simple barter or reciprocity. Some tablets record loans with specified repayments larger than the principal, suggesting that even in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, people understood that lending silver or grain created an expectation of profit. This practice could bind families to long-term obligations, shaping social relations as much as economic ones. Debt was not just a practical reality but a moral and political force. The shekel, as a unit, made this possible by standardizing what might otherwise have been incommensurable. Another layer emerges when we consider weight. The shekel was part of a larger system of weights and measures. 60 shekels made 1 mina, and 60 minas made 1 talent. This sexagesimal structure, based on multiples of 60, reflected Mesopotamia's mathematical innovations. To define debt in shekels was to tie it into a broader system of measurement that governed time, space, and value. A day could be divided into hours, a field into measures, and wealth into shekels, all under a coherent mathematical logic. Money here was not just practical, it was conceptual, part of a worldview that sought order through number. What humbles us is how little of this resembles our modern assumptions about money. There were no coins to pass from hand to hand, no pockets filled with jangling currency. Instead, there were clay tablets etched with wedge-shaped signs, silent witnesses to obligations that might last months or years. The shekel was an idea before it was an object, a measure before it was a medium. It reminds us that money's origins lie not in exchange, but in trust, in record-keeping, in the human urge to make obligations durable across time. There is, of course, much we do not know. Did ordinary households calculate values in shekels when trading among themselves? Or was this language confined to temples and elites? How widely did actual silver circulate in marketplaces? and how often were debts truly paid in metal rather than goods. The evidence suggests that everyday exchange continued to rely on barter and commodity trade, while the shekel governed the larger networks of institutions. But the line between these spheres must have blurred, and people must have developed their own local practices. The haunting question is this: if the first currency was not a coin but a unit of debt, what does that say about the nature of money itself? Was money from the beginning less about freedom of exchange and more about control, less about opportunity and more about obligation? When a farmer in Sumer signed a clay tablet acknowledging a debt of shekels, he was entering a system that bound him to temple, to ruler, to creditor. The shekel gave language to those bonds, but it also gave them permanence. In that sense, Mesopotamia's silver currency was not just a tool of economy. It was the beginning of a system that would define human life for millennia, the endless balancing of accounts, the weight not just of silver but of debt. Was gold always just for the rich, or did it begin as something else, an object of beauty, a sacred material, a trade commodity that later hardened into the symbol of wealth we know today? To answer that, we have to move between different lands of the ancient world, where silver, grain, cattle, and shells were all competing to serve as the measure of value. In Mesopotamia, silver anchored the language of debt, but along the Nile it was gold that gleamed most brightly, not only in temples and tombs, but also in trade caravans and diplomatic gifts. Between the 3rd and the 2nd millennium before the Common Era, gold began to carry a weight beyond ornament. It became one of the earliest materials that could travel long distances and hold its value across cultures, though its role was far from what we might call money today. The Nile Valley had its own peculiar relationship with metals. Unlike Mesopotamia, where silver defined obligations, Egypt had no native silver deposits in its early dynastic period. Gold, however, was plentiful. From the deserts east of the Nile to the mines of Nubia, Egyptian rulers could command streams of the yellow metal. Archaeological surveys in the eastern desert have uncovered remains of ancient mining camps, grinding stones for crushing ore, and even traces of smelting operations dating back to the early dynasties around the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. For Egypt, gold was not only accessible but abundant, and abundance gave it power. Pharaohs hoarded it, temples received it, and artisans shaped it into diadems, cups, and masks. But was this gold money in the way we think of money? The evidence suggests not, at least not at first. In Egypt's Old Kingdom, beginning around the year 2700 before the Common Era, gold was overwhelmingly tied to the divine and the royal. It was the flesh of the gods, according to Egyptian belief, eternal and incorruptible. This made it an ideal material for funerary objects, especially those designed to preserve the ruler's essence into the afterlife. The Great Mask of Tutankhamun, fashioned more than a millennium later in the 14th century before the Common Era, still echoes that same symbolic role: gold as eternity, as divine permanence. Here, gold was not about exchange in markets, but about status and cosmic order. At the same time, Egypt was never isolated, and its gold entered networks that were deeply economic. By the Middle Kingdom, and more prominently in the New Kingdom, gold was a key material in diplomacy and trade. Records from the Amarna letters, written in the 14th century before the Common Era, describe Egyptian pharaohs sending gold as diplomatic gifts to Near Eastern kings. Other rulers pleaded with Egypt for more gold, remarking almost jealously on its abundance. For the kings of Babylon or Mitanni, to receive gold from Egypt was to receive acknowledgement of their status. For Egypt, to send gold was to demonstrate supremacy. In this way, gold became a medium of power across borders, functioning not as coinage but as a currency of prestige. The scarcity of silver within Egypt also sharpened this contrast. In Mesopotamia, silver was the standard of account, yet it was rare in the Nile Valley. Imports of silver had to come through trade, often from the Levant or Anatolia. As a result, Egypt's valuation systems tended to use copper or grain for accounting within its own administration, while gold remained the supreme metal of prestige. In effect, gold in Egypt and silver in Mesopotamia played complementary roles. Each was a standard within its own region, but they meant very different things. Silver was practical, tied to debt and rations, while gold was symbolic, tied to eternity and kingship. This does not mean gold never circulated in more economic contexts. Gold rings and ingots have been found that show signs of being used as units of value. Some texts suggest that gold by weight could be part of exchanges, especially in international trade. Caravans coming from Nubia or ships arriving from Punt carried gold that could be used in negotiations, whether for incense, exotic animals, or other luxury goods. Gold in this sense acted as a store of value, easily transportable, recognisable, and rare enough outside Egypt to command high demand. But it is difficult to call it money in the structured sense, because it lacked the standardised role that silver had in Mesopotamia. Instead, gold operated in multiple registers at once: sacred, political, and occasionally economic. If we shift our view to Anatolia, the Aegean, and beyond, we see similar complexities. The 3rd and 2nd millennia before the Common Era witnessed expanding networks of metallurgy and trade. The shaft graves at Mycenae, dating to around the 16th century before the Common Era, are filled with gold masks, jewellery, and cups. These were clearly symbols of elite status, not ordinary exchange. In the Indus Valley, gold ornaments appear as well, again tied to ritual and elite display. Across regions, gold consistently marks hierarchy and sacredness more than marketplace utility. So what changed between 3000 and 1500 before the Common Era is not that gold suddenly became coinage, but that it began to circulate as a trans-regional medium of value. To the Egyptians it was divine, to their neighbours it was treasure, and in the spaces between these meanings gold acquired a peculiar universality. It could bridge cultures without being standardised, much as cowries did in later centuries. That universality allowed it to become, in a sense, an early world currency of elites, moving through palaces and courts rather than bazaars and stalls. What is striking is how this contrasts with modern assumptions about money. Today we think of money as the great equaliser, the thing everyone uses daily. But in antiquity, gold was the opposite. The more sacred and restricted it was, the more power it carried. A peasant farmer in Old Kingdom Egypt was far more likely to count grain, copper, or labour days than to ever touch gold. To him, gold was distant, locked in temples and tombs, glimpsed only in ceremonies, and yet the very fact that he did not handle it may have reinforced its power. Gold's rarity in daily life made it the perfect tool for rulers to embody something beyond the ordinary. We must also consider whether gold's incorruptibility itself made it the perfect candidate for money in the long run. Silver tarnishes, copper corrodes, but gold remains. This timeless quality likely reinforced its role as a store of value. When rulers sent gifts of gold to one another, they were not only sending wealth, but also sending permanence. A gold bracelet would not decay. It was a fragment of eternity. In this sense, gold already contained the seed of its future as money, though it was not yet framed in those terms. And yet the haunting question lingers. Was gold ever truly money in these early centuries, or was it something more ambiguous? To call it money risks projecting backward a concept that had not yet crystallized. What we see instead is gold as a material that could mean many things at once. Sacred flesh of gods, badge of royalty, instrument of diplomacy, medium of exchange in rare cases. It had not yet become the everyday language of value, but it was already becoming the universal language of power. Perhaps the better question is not when gold became money, but why humans consistently gave it such weight across cultures. Was it its luster, its permanence, its rarity, or the fact that it seemed to defy decay in a world where everything else rotted? The Egyptians saw eternity in it. The Mesopotamians measured obligations in silver, but still coveted Egypt's gold. The Mycenaeans buried their chiefs in it. Over 1,000 years, from the 3rd to the 2nd millennium before the Common Era, gold carved a niche for itself, not by being useful in trade, but by being indispensable in meaning. And maybe that is what made it ready eventually to become money. Not its practicality, but its symbolism. For if money is ultimately about trust and belief, then gold's long history as sacred and eternal may explain why, millennia later, it still gleams in our imagination as the standard by which value itself is judged. Who first stamped metal into money, and why did that moment matter so profoundly? For millennia before, people had weighed silver, traded shells, counted cattle, and hoarded gold ornaments. Value was stored in objects, but those objects had to be weighed, checked, and tested each time. They carried the burden of trust on every exchange. Then, sometime in the 7th century before the Common Era, in a small kingdom on the western edge of Anatolia, something new appeared. Pieces of metal marked with symbols of authority, guaranteed by the state, accepted at face value rather than by weight alone. These were the first coins, and they emerged in Lydia. Lydia was a land both fortunate and restless. Nestled between the Aegean coast and the Anatolian plateau, its rivers ran with electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver. The Pactolus River in particular carried deposits of this pale, gleaming substance. Unlike pure gold or silver, electrum was uneven. Its ratio of gold to silver varied, making its value inconsistent if traded by weight alone. To solve this, Lydian rulers began issuing standard pieces of electrum stamped with a design. This design was a guarantee. It told the holder that the piece was of a recognised weight and backed by the authority of the king. In this way, a material that was naturally uncertain became reliable through political trust. The earliest of these coins are usually dated to around the reign of King Aliats, in the early 6th century before the Common Era. They were small, bean-shaped lumps of electrum, their surfaces pressed with simple marks. Later, under King Croesus, Lydia refined the system further. Croesus, who ruled in the mid-6th century before the Common Era, is credited with introducing coins of pure gold and pure silver, separating the alloy into distinct standards. This was a crucial step because it made the value of each coin transparent. A gold croisade was gold, a silver croisade was silver, and both were accepted across a widening circle of trade. These innovations did not remain in Lydia alone. The Ionian Greek cities along the coast, including Miletus and Ephesus, quickly adopted coinage. Their proximity to Lydia and their constant interactions in trade made coins attractive. For merchants used to haggling over weights of metal or exchanging goods directly, coins offered a portable, recognisable and efficient medium. A stamped piece of metal could change hands quickly without lengthy verification. In bustling marketplaces, in ports where goods from across the Mediterranean arrived, this speed mattered. The design stamped on these early coins also carried meaning beyond assurance of weight. They were symbols of identity and power. The Lydians used lions, emblems of their dynasty. The Greeks who followed stamped their coins with owls, turtles, or city symbols. A coin was not only a piece of metal, but also a statement. It tied the transaction to a community, a ruler, a shared trust. In a sense, every coin was a political message as much as an economic tool. One might wonder, why did coinage emerge in Lydia rather than in the great civilizations further east, where wealth and trade had flourished for centuries? Part of the answer lies in geography. Lydia sat at a crossroads, between the Near Eastern kingdoms and the Greek world. It was close enough to inherit the sophisticated accounting traditions of Mesopotamia and Egypt, but also close to the dynamic trade networks of the Aegean. It was small enough to experiment, flexible enough to innovate, and wealthy enough in electrum to sustain the attempt. The effect was transformative. For the first time, money became not only a store of value and a medium of exchange, but also a symbol recognised on sight. The practicalities of weighing and assaying diminished. Trust moved from the hands of individual traders to the authority of a stamp. This was a shift in psychology as much as in economics. When someone accepted a coin, they were not trusting the person across from them. They were trusting the issuing authority. This created a new kind of link between subjects and rulers, one that bound economies to political power more tightly than before. The legend of King Croesus captures this moment vividly. Croesus was remembered as fabulously wealthy, so wealthy that his name became proverbial. To be as rich as Croesus was to possess boundless wealth. Behind that legend lay a real innovation. His coins circulated far beyond Lydia, influencing practices across the Mediterranean. The Persians, who conquered Lydia in the mid-6th century before the Common Era, adopted and adapted coinage themselves. Greek city-states refined it further, creating distinct civic coinages that became hallmarks of their identities. The spark lit in Lydia spread rapidly, reshaping economies and politics alike. But did everyone embrace coins equally? The evidence suggests that while elites and traders found them useful, many ordinary transactions still relied on barter, weights of silver, or commodities. A farmer might still pay in grain, a shepherd in sheep. Coins did not replace older forms of value overnight. Instead, they added a new layer, one particularly suited to long-distance trade, to taxation, and to payments that required standardization. The story of coins, then, is not one of sudden revolution, but of gradual layering. The coin existed alongside other systems, slowly growing in importance until it became dominant. We might also ask, did coins democratize money, or did they strengthen rulers' control? In Lydia's case, the latter seems likely. By issuing stamped metal, the king controlled the standard. He could adjust weights, recall old issues, introduce new ones. Coinage allowed rulers to imprint their authority on every transaction, turning the marketplace into a space where political power was felt daily. In this sense, coins were not only practical tools but also instruments of centralization. Archaeological finds confirm the reach of Lydian coinage. Hoards of early electrum coins have been uncovered in Asia Minor and Greece, sometimes buried, sometimes lost in temples or houses. These coins often bear the simple punch marks of early issues, testimony to their experimental beginnings. As the designs grew more elaborate, their role as both economic and cultural objects expanded. Coins became a canvas for art as well as a guarantee of value. Yet the haunting question remains, why at this moment, in this place, did humans decide to stamp metal into money? Was it necessity, born of trade complications? Was it abundance, since Lydia's electrum provided raw material in unusual quantities? Or was it a more subtle shift, a realization that trust could be standardized through symbols? We may never fully know. What we do know is that with the Lydian coin, money took on a form that would dominate much of history to come. It became something you could hold, carry, and recognize instantly, a shared language of value that transcended borders. And so, in the valleys of western Anatolia, around the year 600 before the Common Era, the world's first coins were struck. They were small, uneven lumps of electrum stamped with lions, but they carried within them an idea so powerful that it would ripple outward for millennia. From Lydia, the experiment spread into Greece, into Persia, and beyond, embedding itself in economies and imaginations alike. And we are left to wonder, when those first coins clinked in a trader's hand, did he know he was holding not just metal, but the beginning of an entirely new way of thinking about trust, value, and power? What happens when soldiers begin to demand silver instead of honour? For much of early Greek history, war was imagined as the duty of citizens who took up arms for their polis out of a loyalty and shared survival. Yet by the 5th century before the Common Era, something had shifted. Coinage, once a useful tool for merchants, became the bloodstream of armies and the pulse of empires. Silver and bronze no longer represented only commerce. They became instruments of war and politics, and their availability determined the rise or collapse of entire states. The story is most clearly seen in Athens. In the early 5th century before the Common Era, the Athenians made a discovery that would transform their city and, in many ways, the Greek world. In the region of Laurion, a rugged stretch of land southeast of Athens, lay rich deposits of silver ore. Mining these veins was not easy. It required tunnels, labourers, furnaces, and a state willing to invest in infrastructure. But the rewards were immense. From these mines flowed the silver that would fill the coinage of Athens, the famous tetradrachms stamped with the head of Athena on one side and the owl, the symbol, on the other. These coins, sturdy and widely recognisable, became trusted currency across the Mediterranean. They were so consistent in weight and purity that traders accepted them far from Athens, and soldiers carried them into distant campaigns. But the true revolution was not economic alone. With this flood of silver, Athens gained the means to pay its rowers, its hoplites, and eventually the thousands of citizens who manned its vast naval fleet. War was no longer the duty of those who could afford to leave their farms for a season. It became a profession sustained by state payments. In this shift, coinage became a political force as well as a military one. When the Persian Wars erupted in the early 5th century before the Common Era, Athens was still a rising power. The decision to build a great fleet of triremes was, in large part, made possible by the silver from Laurion. Each trireme required 200 men to row, and these men could not work without pay. Silver made their service possible. Themistocles, the Athenian statesman often credited with steering Athens toward naval supremacy, saw the mines as a gift from the gods. Instead of distributing the wealth directly to citizens, he argued for its use in building ships. That decision helped Athens not only repel Persia, but also transform itself into a maritime empire. The consequences were immense. With a paid navy, Athens could project power far beyond its borders. Control of the seas allowed it to dominate trade routes and to bind other Greek city-states into the Delian League, a coalition formed against Persia but quickly repurposed into an Athenian empire in all but name. Tribute collected from allies often flowed back in the form of silver coinage, reinforcing the cycle. Soldiers and sailors fought for wages, and their wages kept the empire afloat. Money and power became inseparable. At the same time, this use of coinage reshaped politics at home. Democracy in Athens thrived partly because silver allowed citizens of modest means to participate in public life. Jurors were paid for their service, as were officials and assembly-goers. The city could sustain a wide base of political engagement because silver redistributed through wages and stipends supported citizens who otherwise might not afford to leave their work. Thus, coinage and democracy were intertwined, each reinforcing the other. But silver's gift was double-edged. Paying soldiers created dependence, and dependence created vulnerability. When silver was abundant, armies and fleets could be maintained, allies coerced, and enemies defeated. But when revenue faltered, the entire system shook. In the later stages of the Peloponnesian War, for instance, Sparta received Persian subsidies that allowed it to build fleets and pay rowers, breaking Athens' advantage. The struggle was no longer only about courage or tactics, it was about who could supply coinage most consistently. Victory depended not just on soldiers' valour, but on the minting of silver discs stamped with gods and owls. Other Greek city-states followed similar paths. Corinth, Aegina, and others issued their own coinages, each with distinctive designs. These coins circulated widely, but the principle remained the same. Coinage allowed states to maintain professional armies and navies, transforming warfare from citizen duty to paid service. Mercenaries became increasingly common, men who fought not for their homeland but for whoever offered the best wages. This marked a profound shift in the nature of Greek warfare. Loyalty was no longer always bound to the polis, it was bound to coinage. Archaeological evidence of coin hoards from this period illustrates the scale of monetization. Soldiers and sailors carried their pay, sometimes burying it for safekeeping or losing it in campaigns. The uniformity of Athenian owls made them especially favoured in international markets, and their presence far from Attica demonstrates how far the reach of Athenian coinage extended. The mines of Laurion, dark and gruelling, echoed in the clang of coin presses and the clash of naval battles. Yet as much as coinage empowered Athens, it also sowed the seeds of instability. The reliance on paid service meant that if payment faltered, loyalty could waver. Mercenaries could desert or even turn against their employers. Cities that could not maintain regular coinage risked collapse. In this way, silver was both glue and solvent, binding empires together, but also threatening to dissolve them if the flow stopped. Looking back, we can see how radical this shift was. Before coinage, warfare had been seasonal, tied to the agricultural cycle, fought by men who returned to their farms afterward. With coinage, warfare became continuous, professionalized, and scalable. Empires could extend themselves far beyond what subsistence economies allowed. Political systems like Athenian democracy could broaden participation through payments, but at the cost of tethering freedom to the mines and the mint. It raises a haunting question. When Athenians cheered the launch of their gleaming triremes, when they stamped Athena's owl onto new silver discs, did they know they were binding their democracy, their empire, and their very survival to the extraction of metal from deep underground? Did they sense that honour was being weighed, ounce by ounce, against silver? We may never know. What we do know is that in the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era, the Greeks taught the world a lesson. Armies and empires marched not only on courage or grain, but also on coins. And from that moment, no state that wished to wield power could ignore the call of money. How do you control an empire with pocket change? At first glance, coins might seem too small and too ordinary to bear the weight of an empire as vast and turbulent as Rome. Yet the Roman world, stretching from the windswept frontiers of Britain to the deserts of Syria, was held together not only by legions and roads, but also by the clink of coins exchanged in markets, barracks, and temples. Roman coinage was more than currency. It was a language, a propaganda tool, a contract of trust between state and people. Every denarius, every sestertius, carried messages from emperors who might never step foot in the distant provinces where those coins circulated. They were the empire's pocket-sized messengers. The story of Roman coinage begins in the 3rd century before the Common Era, when Rome was still carving out its dominance in Italy. Earlier Romans had used bronze bars and ingots, cumbersome and awkward for everyday trade. As Rome grew and clashed with Carthage in the Punic Wars, the need for more practical, portable money became urgent. Around the early 3rd century before the Common Era, Rome introduced the denarius, a small silver coin that would become the backbone of its economy for centuries. The denarius weighed about 4.5 grams, and its consistency and weight and purity made it widely trusted. Alongside it came bronze and copper coins for smaller exchanges and gold coins for larger transactions. By the 2nd century before the Common Era, the denarius was everywhere. Soldiers received their wages in denarii, and merchants in the far provinces could rely on the coin's value. Roman expansion and Roman money went hand in hand. As legions advanced, so too did the mint. In newly conquered lands, local coinages were sometimes tolerated, but increasingly Roman coins dominated, replacing older systems. The empire could not enforce its will everywhere through garrisons alone, but coins could infiltrate markets, homes, and temples, binding distant communities into the Roman economic order. Coins also became a mirror of Roman politics. On their faces, emperors projected power, lineage, and divine favour. Julius Caesar, in the mid-1st century before the Common Era, was the first Roman to place his own portrait on coins during his lifetime. This was no small gesture. Until then, coinage had depicted gods, personifications, and symbolic motifs. By stamping his likeness, Caesar claimed a kind of semi-divine authority, challenging the republican tradition. After his assassination, his image and the title Divus Julius continued to appear on coins, cementing the link between coinage and imperial propaganda. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, perfected this art. His coins displayed not only his face, but also messages of peace, fertility, military victories, and continuity with Rome's divine ancestors. The denarius became a portable billboard for the new order. Throughout the empire, peasants and soldiers might never meet Augustus, but they carried his face in their purses. Later emperors followed suit, each carefully crafting their coinage to project strength, piety, or legitimacy. In times of crisis, coins were among the first places where emperors sought to assert their rule. A rebel or usurper could mint coins to declare his authority, and if those coins circulated widely, the claim gained weight. Coins also carried messages of Rome's achievements. Victories were celebrated with coins depicting conquered peoples, captured weapons, or triumphant generals. Religious festivals, building projects, or even grain shipments were immortalized in metal. For the common Roman, a coin was not only a tool of exchange, but a window into the broader world of the empire. Coins connected ordinary people to events and rulers far beyond their village or city. But the strength of this system rested on trust, and trust depended on the consistency of metal content. For several centuries, the denarius retained a relatively stable silver content. Yet as the empire strained under military costs and political turmoil, debasement began. Debasement is the process of reducing the precious metal in a coin while keeping its nominal value the same. A denarius that once held nearly pure silver might later contain only half, then less than a quarter, with the rest alloyed with cheaper metals. This process accelerated during the 3rd century of the Common Era, an age historians often call the crisis of the 3rd century. Rome faced invasions, civil wars, plagues, and economic collapse. Emperors desperate to pay soldiers and administrators turned increasingly to debased coinage. Coins grew lighter, their silver content diminished, and eventually many were little more than bronze discs washed with a thin silver coating. Trust eroded. Merchants demanded higher prices, Soldiers rioted when their wages lost value. Inflation soared. The cycle of debasement reveals the fragile balance between coinage and empire. When coins were trusted, they bound the empire together. When trust broke, cracks appeared everywhere. Some emperors attempted reforms. Diocletian, at the end of the 3rd century of the Common Era, tried to stabilize the currency and even issued an edict on maximum prices to curb inflation. Constantine, in the early 4th century, introduced the solidus, a new gold coin of remarkable consistency. The solidus restored faith in coinage and would endure for centuries, long after the Western Empire fell. The Roman mint was not just about economics, it was also about control. By producing coins, the state could regulate the medium of exchange. The mints themselves were symbols of the imperial power, often located in key cities across the empire. Control of a mint was control of a message, a lifeline, a means to sustain armies. During civil wars, rival emperors fought as much for the loyalty of mints as for legions, because coinage proclaimed legitimacy. Archaeological finds of coin hoards testify to both trust and fear. People buried coins in times of crisis, hoping to recover them later. Thousands of hoards have been found, often never reclaimed, perhaps because their owners perished or never returned. These buried caches give us a map of unrest, showing where war or instability forced people to hide their savings. They also remind us that coins were more than state propaganda. They were lifelines for ordinary people trying to protect their families in uncertain times. The Roman coinage system also reflected hierarchy. Gold ore and later solidi were used by elites in large transactions and imperial treasuries. Silver denarii and later antoniniani circulated widely among soldiers and merchants. Bronze and copper coins handled the daily exchanges of ordinary people in markets and taverns. In this way, the very coins in one's hand mirrored social position, embedding inequality into the medium of exchange itself. And yet coins were also unifiers. The same image of an emperor, the same symbolic motifs, were carried in the hands of senators in Rome and farmers in Gaul. In a world of diverse languages and customs, coins offered a common iconography and a shared trust in value. Rome ruled not only by the sword, but also by the steady rhythm of coinage moving through markets, taxes, and wages. It leaves us with a question. Could Rome have held its empire together without this system of coins? The roads, the legions, the laws, all were crucial, but coins made them function. They allowed soldiers to be paid, taxes to be collected, trade to flourish, propaganda to reach even the illiterate. Rome's coinage was an empire in miniature, each piece a fragment of sovereignty. When we hold a Roman coin today, worn smooth by countless hands, we hold more than metal. We hold a whisper of how an empire once ruled the world with pocket change. Why did China invent money twice? The question may sound odd at first, but the record of Chinese history gives us reason to pause and think. Long before the rise of coins in the Mediterranean, or the spread of silver and gold as symbols of wealth, communities in ancient China were experimenting with shells, casting strange metallic tokens shaped like spades and knives, and eventually producing the world's first paper notes. The story of Chinese money is less about a single invention than about a long tradition of innovation and reinvention, tied closely to the authority of the state and the problem of trust. The earliest Chinese currency is not metal but shell. Archaeologists working in Neolithic sites from around the 2nd millennium before the Common Era often recover fragments of cowrie shells, sometimes in large quantities, sometimes carefully arranged in burials. Genuine cowries, which had to be imported from distant southern seas, were prized in northern China where they did not naturally occur. Their rarity, beauty and durability made them excellent candidates for use as symbols of value. Some of the oldest Chinese characters in oracle bone script even include the stylized shape of a cowrie shell to denote wealth or exchange. It is not a coincidence that the written language itself preserves the memory of shells as money. Over time, real shells gave way to imitations. By the late 2nd millennium before the Common Era, during the Shang dynasty, artisans were carving shell-shaped tokens out of bone, stone, and eventually bronze. These imitation cowries suggest a transition from natural to manufactured currency, one that reveals both the growing demand for standardized mediums of exchange and the ability of centralized authorities to regulate them. Bronze cowries, cast in molds and distributed in numbers, could not be confused with natural shells. They carried the symbolic weight of the older practice, but added a layer of control that favoured rulers who wanted to stabilise trade and tribute. By the first millennium before the Common Era, as Chinese society grew more complex and states competed for dominance in the so-called Spring and Autumn period, and later the Warring States period, money itself diversified. The famous knife and spade coins emerged in this era. These were not coins in the round form we usually imagine, but flat bronze tokens cast in the shape of miniature tools. Some resembled spades or shovels, with short handles and flaring blades. Others resembled knives, complete with stylized handles and blades, sometimes inscribed with characters indicating the issuing authority or city. Why tools? Theories vary. Some scholars suggest that these forms recalled actual utilitarian objects once exchanged in barter, such as agricultural implements or weapons. By shrinking them into bronze miniatures, communities symbolized value while creating portable substitutes. Others argue that the shapes carried symbolic resonance linking wealth with labour, land, or martial power. Whatever the case, these unusual shapes reveal that money in ancient China was not yet a universal abstraction, but a deeply cultural artifact, reflecting the associations people held between value and material life. Standardization came gradually. Different regions minted their own types of spade or knife money, with variations in size, weight, and inscription. The Zhou dynasty, particularly in its later centuries, saw increasing attempts to unify these currencies, but true standardization would only come with the rise of the Qin in the late 3rd century before the Common Era. When Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, unified China in 221 before the Common Era, he famously standardized weights, measures, script, and currency. He abolished the diverse spade and knife forms and introduced round bronze coins with square holes in the centre, known as banliang. These round coins, easy to string together through their central hole, became a lasting feature of Chinese money for centuries. The design was simple and efficient, round to symbolize heaven, square to symbolize earth, embodying a cosmological harmony in the very shape of the coin. Strings of coins could be counted by the hundreds, tied and carried across the empire. Trust came not only from the state's authority but also from the predictability of form and weight. Successive dynasties refined this system, adjusting weights and inscriptions but largely maintaining the round with square hole format. Coins bore inscriptions indicating their era of casting or the authority of the emperor, reinforcing the intimate link between money and political legitimacy. Yet the challenges of scale and trust never disappeared. The empire was vast, its economy enormous, and bronze coinage, though durable, was heavy and cumbersome for large transactions. This pressure set the stage for one of China's most remarkable contributions to world history: paper money. The origins of Chinese paper currency are somewhat debated, but the seeds appear in the Tang dynasty around the 7th century of the Common Era, when merchants began using promissory notes and drafts as a way to avoid transporting heavy coinage across dangerous trade routes. These private notes, known as flying cash, could be redeemed in distant markets, acting as early forms of credit instruments. By the Song dynasty, beginning in the 10th century of the Common Era, the state stepped in. The Song government, facing both economic expansion and military needs, began to issue official paper notes. Known as jiaozi, these notes were backed by the state and circulated widely. Unlike earlier private instruments, they carried the authority of the dynasty itself. Paper money allowed for far greater flexibility, enabling the state to mobilize resources quickly and merchants to trade more efficiently across long distances. But paper money also carried risks. Unlike coins made of bronze, silver, or gold, paper had no intrinsic value. Its worth depended entirely on trust in the issuing authority. When the Song government managed the supply carefully, confidence remained. But when political pressures mounted, overprinting led to inflation. Later dynasties, including the Yuan under Mongol rule, embraced paper currency, sometimes too enthusiastically, resulting in severe economic instability when trust collapsed. The invention of paper money was revolutionary not only for China but for the world. It demonstrated for the first time that value could be detached entirely from metal and material scarcity, resting instead on shared belief and political power. In many ways, this was the second invention of money in China, the leap from physical tokens like shells and bronze coins to abstract representations of value printed on paper. It was an act of faith, one that reshaped commerce and governance. Archaeological finds, inscriptions, and surviving fragments of notes remind us of the fragility and brilliance of this system. Early paper money bore elaborate designs, official seals, and warnings against counterfeiting. Some even included threats of severe punishments for those who dared to forge them. These measures highlight both the innovation and the anxiety surrounding paper money. It was a bold experiment that depended on a delicate balance of authority, scarcity, and trust. Looking back, the Chinese trajectory of money reveals a series of questions we still grapple with today. How much of value lies in material substance, and how much in collective belief? Why do some mediums of exchange flourish while others collapse? And perhaps most hauntingly, was China's early leap into paper money a glimpse of our own modern financial systems, built less on gold and silver than on trust and promises? China did not invent money once, but twice. First, when shells and bronze tokens became standardized instruments of exchange under powerful states. And again, when paper, light and fragile, was declared by emperors to hold the weight of armies and markets. It is a story of creativity, ambition and risk, reminding us that money has always been more than metal. It is memory, trust and imagination pressed into forms we agree to carry in our hands. How did a piece of wood become worth more than silver? At first, it seems almost laughable to imagine entire economies leaning on sticks marked with notches. Yet for much of medieval Europe, particularly from the 9th century through the 15th century of the Common Era, this is exactly what happened. Wooden tally sticks carved with careful cuts to record obligations circulated not as trinkets, but as binding contracts. They were not simply reminders, but objects of trust, standing in for wealth, taxes, and even state revenue. To understand their significance is to see that money has always been less about the substance in one's hand, and more about the memory it represents. The practice of tallying debts by cutting notches into wood predates medieval Europe. Anthropologists point to similar devices used across the world to keep track of obligations, livestock or trade exchanges. But in Europe of the early Middle Ages, after the collapse of Roman administrative structures, tally sticks became central. Coins still existed, but they were often scarce, debased, or limited to certain regions. In rural economies where barter and obligation tied people together, the tally stick emerged as a powerful substitute for money. The system worked in a straightforward but ingenious way. A piece of hazelwood or willow would be split down the middle. Notches were carved into the surface, each mark representing a particular sum owed. Then the stick was broken lengthwise, creating two halves, one half called the stock, usually retained by the creditor, and the other called the foil, kept by the debtor. The split ensured that neither half could be altered without obvious damage. Only when matched together would the notches align perfectly, proving the authenticity of the obligation. It was, in a sense, a medieval form of cryptography. Simple, but almost impossible to forge without detection. By the 9th century, tally sticks were already entrenched in feudal accounting. Lords used them to record rents from peasants, monasteries to track obligations from tenants, and merchants to mark advances and credits. What mattered was not that the stick had intrinsic value, but that it carried memory, sealed in wood, binding both parties in a shared record of debt. Even in communities where coins circulated, tally sticks thrived because they could store memory over long stretches of time, far more flexible than a handful of silver. The English crown made the tally stick into an instrument of government finance by the 12th century. When Henry I reigned in the early 12th century, he institutionalised their use for collecting taxes. Sheriffs and officials received tallies as evidence of payments due to the exchequer. Rather than carrying coin to London, local authorities could deliver a wooden stick inscribed with notches. The Treasury, upon receiving the matching stock, accepted it as a valid proof of revenue owed. Thus, wood became as authoritative as silver, for it embodied an entry in the kingdom's memory. This system gave rise to a peculiar form of circulation. Tallies could change hands, bought and sold like commodities. If a landowner owed taxes to the crown but had no coin, he might pass along a tally as payment to another. who then might transfer it further down the chain. In effect, tallies circulated as a form of proto-money. They were promises carved in wood, each carrying the authority of the king's treasury. So widespread did this practice become that by the 13th century, some tally sticks commanded more trust than coin, since they were less likely to be clipped, forged, or debased. It is important to pause and recognise the oddity here. A tally stick is nothing but wood. Its power derived entirely from social agreement and institutional trust. This is why historians like the anthropologist Graeber describe tally sticks as examples of money as memory. Unlike metal coins, which claimed value through scarcity, tally sticks worked because they carried the shared recollection of obligation, enforced by community and state. The role of tallies extended beyond taxation. Markets used them to record purchases and sales when coin was absent. Farmers could pay for supplies with a tally, redeemable later after harvest. Soldiers might be issued tallies as pay, to be cashed in once the crown secured enough silver. Monasteries employed them to track alms, rents, and gifts. In all these cases, the stick was not a symbol of wealth in itself, but a portable ledger. It was, in effect, accounting embodied. The durability of this system should not be underestimated. From the 9th through the 15th centuries, tally sticks remained in active use. Coins rose and fell, silver supplies fluctuated, but tallies endured. Even as commerce expanded and towns grew in the later Middle Ages, tallies maintained credibility. Their strength lay in their adaptability. A tally could represent a small rent payment or a massive tax obligation, and its authenticity was visible to anyone who held half of the pair. The symbolism of breaking the stick also carried weight. It represented the mutual acknowledgement of obligation, a ritual of shared recognition. The split halves reminded both creditor and debtor that their fortunes were tied together. When the debt was settled, the halves could be reunited, destroying the memory inscribed in wood. Until then, the tally was a living fragment of obligation, both proof and promise. Feudal Europe thrived on layers of obligation, and tally sticks fit this world seamlessly. A peasant's dues to his lord, a knight's obligations to his overlord, a merchant's credit extended to a partner, all these could be inscribed into wood. In this way, tally sticks reveal how economies can function without heavy reliance on coinage. They remind us that wealth is not always metal stored in chests, but trust distributed across relationships. Over time, tallies accumulated not just in manor houses and markets, but in the heart of royal treasuries. The English exchequer stored vast numbers of them, recording taxes and debts owed to the crown. So many were piled up that by the 13th and 14th centuries the archives bulged with thousands of sticks. Each one represented a sliver of the kingdom's financial history, a forest transformed into an empire of memory. The reliance on tallies also illuminates the fragility of medieval money. Coins could be debased by unscrupulous rulers, but tallies, while harder to counterfeit, relied on institutional continuity. If the crown failed to honour them, their value collapsed. This precarious balance is part of why historians emphasise that money is always a social technology, not merely a substance. The worth of a tally lay in the continued authority of the exchequer, just as today's notes or digital entries rely on trust in issuing institutions. Interestingly, the very simplicity of tally sticks is what made them so enduring. Unlike parchment records, they could not easily be altered. Unlike coin, they carried no temptation to clip or melt down. And unlike oral promises, they endured beyond the lifespan or memory of individuals. They were at once lowly pieces of wood and essential arteries of the medieval economy. Yet we should resist the temptation to see them as quaint relics. For 6 centuries they underpinned serious systems of finance, taxation and trade. Whole armies were supplied because of them. Cathedrals built, fields rented, debts reconciled. To dismiss them as primitive would miss the deeper truth. They show how much of money lies not in precious material, but in collective remembrance. When we ask how a piece of wood could be worth more than silver, the answer is unsettling, because memory itself can become money. The tally stick, simple as it was, became a vessel of obligation strong enough to carry empires. And if wood could serve as money for centuries, what does that say about the very nature of value? Perhaps the haunting question is not how wood once became wealth, but how many of our own tokens of value are also just sticks waiting to burn. Why did empires keep coming back to shiny metal? Across the world in the centuries between the 16th and the 19th, rulers, merchants and bankers attempted again and again to tie the foundations of wealth to gold and silver. They could not resist it, despite knowing that money had long been more complicated than a glittering coin. For them, precious metals promised stability, something concrete in an age of expanding trade, wars of empire and increasing paper records. They believed that if value was anchored to metal, then the storms of politics, speculation and inflation could be held at bay. Whether they were right is another question, but the obsession itself shaped the birth of the modern global economy. The story begins in the 16th century when Europe's hunger for bullion became insatiable. The so-called discovery of the Americas brought not just land, but rivers of silver and gold. Spanish ships carried vast quantities of bullion across the Atlantic, most famously from the mines at Potosi, in what is now Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico. Potosi's Cerro Rico, the rich mountain, yielded so much silver that it became a symbol of European domination and indigenous exploitation. Enslaved and coerced workers pulled ore from tunnels at staggering human cost, and mule trains carried it to refineries where mercury amalgamation turned stone into treasure. From there, ingots and coins flowed into the coffers of the Spanish crown. But silver rarely stayed in Spain for long. Much of it moved across Europe to pay for wars and debts and imports. Even more importantly, enormous amounts of bullion left Europe altogether, bound for Asia. Chinese demand for silver was extraordinary, particularly under the Ming dynasty, which had adopted silver as the principal medium of taxation and exchange. In effect, the entire planet's money supply became linked through silver. A farmer in Potosi, a merchant in Seville, a banker in Genoa, and a tax collector in Beijing were tied together by this chain of metal. This was perhaps the first true global currency system built not on paper agreements or promises alone, but on actual shipments of bullion across oceans. It is tempting to think of gold and silver as natural choices for this role. They are relatively scarce, durable and divisible. But the real reason empires clung to them was psychological and political. Rulers feared the fragility of credit. Paper notes, drafts, or mere promises could evaporate with a bankrupt merchant or a lost battle. Metal, by contrast, seemed eternal. A gold coin from the 16th century could still buy something in the 17th, while a written contract might mean nothing once the debtor vanished. The metal itself gave comfort in an unstable world. Still, there was a dark irony. Precious metals could not guarantee stability because their supply was tied to mines and conquest. When silver poured from Potosi, prices across Europe rose in what economists later called the price revolution. Inflation spread as more coins chased the same goods. Instead of providing stability, the sudden flood of silver destabilized entire economies. Spain, awash in bullion, paradoxically sank into repeated bankruptcies. Its wealth drained into the hands of financiers and creditors abroad. The belief in the solidity of metal proved more symbolic than practical, yet even as evidence of instability mounted, the attachment to bullion deepened. In the 17th century, other empires joined the hunt. The Dutch built their commercial dominance on the careful management of silver and gold flows, using Amsterdam as a clearinghouse where bullion could be exchanged and regulated. The English, emerging as a rising power, also leaned on bullion as the anchor for their growing financial system. In both cases, the physical presence of metal in vaults reassured merchants that their notes and bills of exchange were backed by something tangible. By the 18th century, gold began to displace silver as the favoured anchor in much of Europe. Silver was abundant but increasingly volatile in supply. Gold, rarer and symbolically weightier, seemed the more reliable standard. Britain, for instance, gradually shifted toward a gold-based system during the 18th and early 19th centuries, even before its full legal adoption of a gold standard. In this environment, the idea took shape that a nation's money should be redeemable in a fixed amount of precious metal. Colonialism reinforced this pattern. As European powers expanded across Africa, Asia and the Americas, they sought control of mines and bullion flows. The Portuguese in Brazil tapped immense gold fields, feeding European markets and enriching Lisbon. The French, British and others sought the same. The logic was straightforward. Power required money, money required stability, and stability required metal. Armies were paid with coin, navies provisioned with bullion, and treaties underwritten by shipments of gold and silver. China remained central throughout this story. Its demand for silver in the 16th and 17th centuries had drawn Europe into the first global bullion economy. But by the 18th and 19th centuries, this dependence became a weakness. When British merchants began exporting opium to China to correct a trade imbalance, the result was a reversal of silver flows. The drain of bullion destabilized the Qing economy and sparked conflicts that would reshape the 19th century. Once again, the belief that silver embodied stability collided with the reality that its flow could undermine entire states. The irony of these centuries is that the closer empires tried to tie themselves to precious metals, the more they revealed the fragility of that anchor. Wars, trade imbalances, and new discoveries could change the supply overnight. Yet rulers and economists kept returning to the same solution: fix value in metal, and all would be well. They believed that the glitter of bullion was a shield against chaos. It is easy to see the allure. A pile of gold coins on a table seems eternal, immune to politics or memory. But history suggests otherwise. The gold and silver of early modern empires were not simply inert treasures. They were pulled from mines by human labour, carried across oceans by fragile ships, and melted into coins stamped with royal faces. Their value lay as much in the violence and institutions that backed them as in the shimmering surface of the metal. By the dawn of the 19th century, the idea of a gold standard was no longer just a practice, but an ideology. Economists and politicians spoke of it as the natural way to stabilise currency. Yet it had taken centuries of turbulent experiment, inflation, collapse, and conquest to get there. The shiny metal that seemed so reliable had brought both prosperity and ruin. So why did empires keep coming back to it? Perhaps because metal offered a kind of illusion, a tangible anchor in a world where promises were often broken. Gold and silver looked eternal, even as their supplies rose and fell. They shone in vaults and crowns, convincing rulers and subjects alike that wealth could be held in the palm of a hand. The haunting question is whether that illusion was ever real. If centuries of bullion economies ended in instability, then maybe gold and silver were never truly solid foundations, but shimmering mirrors of human trust. And if so, what does that mean for the way we anchor value today? Why does paper have value just because the state says so? For much of human history, value was imagined as something grounded in metal, in weight, in the tangibility of gold and silver. Yet beginning in the 17th century and accelerating ever since, states, merchants, and ordinary people began to live with a different kind of money. Currency that had no intrinsic worth beyond the promise that others would accept it. This is what we call fiat money, a word from the Latin fiat, meaning let it be done. In other words, money by decree. It is an extraordinary leap of imagination, and perhaps of faith, to treat a scrap of paper, or today a series of digits, as wealth in itself. The question is not so much why this system emerged, but how human societies learned to trust it, and why it still seems to work. The origins can be traced to early experiments with paper money in China during the Song dynasty, beginning in the 11th century. These were not yet fully fiat, since they were often linked to reserves or redeemable in coin. But the precedent was there. The state could issue notes backed by its authority rather than a specific lump of metal. In Europe, the shift came later. During the 17th century, states and merchants faced practical limits. Wars were costly, trade was expanding, and carrying bullion was slow, dangerous, and insufficient. Banks in cities like Amsterdam and Stockholm began issuing notes that could circulate more easily than sacks of coin. In England, the Bank of England was founded in the year 1694 to finance war, and its notes soon circulated as a form of currency. These notes were initially promises to pay in metal, but over time people began using them as if they were money in themselves. The real turning point came when governments realised that they could break the tie altogether between notes and precious metals. This did not happen all at once, but through crises. In the 18th and 19th centuries, wars drained treasuries, forcing suspensions of redemption. During the Napoleonic Wars, Britain suspended the convertibility of its banknotes into gold. People continued to use the notes, not because they could be redeemed, but because they trusted the government and because there was no alternative. Each suspension and return to convertibility revealed the fragility of the system, yet also its resilience. The mere authority of the state and the willingness of people to accept its word could keep money functioning, even without metal behind it. By the 20th century, fiat money had become the global norm. The Great Depression, the World Wars, and finally the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in the early 1970s all played a role. When the United States formally abandoned the gold standard under President Nixon in 1971, it marked the decisive end of any link between major currencies and precious metal. From then on, the value of money rested entirely on trust in governments, central banks, and the broader economy. What had once been considered a dangerous experiment became ordinary reality. The advantages of fiat money are obvious in hindsight. It is flexible. A government can expand or contract the supply depending on economic conditions. This allows for responses to crises, investment in infrastructure, and the financing of wars without the strict limitations of metal reserves. It is portable and scalable, functioning in enormous economies where no realistic stockpile of gold could keep pace with demand. Fiat money also encourages financial innovation, making possible complex credit systems, bonds, and international markets that would be unthinkable if every transaction required weighing metal. But the system carries risks, and those risks explain why many resisted it for so long. Without the anchor of metal, fiat money depends entirely on confidence. If people lose faith in a government's promises, paper notes can collapse into worthlessness. History is filled with such examples. In the 18th century France, the assignats issued during the Revolution spiraled into hyperinflation and were eventually abandoned. In the early 20th century, the Weimar Republic in Germany saw its currency disintegrate as paper notes became less valuable by the hour. Zimbabwe in the early 21st century printed notes with absurd denominations as trust evaporated. Each case showed that fiat money is only as strong as the institutions and social contracts that sustain it. Yet those collapses are exceptions rather than the rule. Most of the time, fiat systems hold together because people agree, collectively, that they do. A note says, this is legal tender, and by law and by habit it circulates. This reliance on trust might seem fragile, but in practice it can be more stable than a metal-based system, which is vulnerable to sudden discoveries, mine output, or the political control of bullion. A gold coin can be clipped, debased, or hoarded. A paper note, by contrast, is infinitely reproducible by the state, and its value can be managed by policy rather than geology. The philosophical leap is profound. For millennia, humans tied money to objects, shells, cattle, silver, gold. Fiat money untethered value from substance and rooted it in collective belief. It is an act of imagination, as much as of economics. Some anthropologists argue that this brings money full circle, back to its origins in memory and trust. In the Paleolithic and Neolithic periods, debts and gifts were recorded in mines and customs, not in metal. Fiat money, in a way, is a return to that principle, but now administered at scale by states and central banks rather than small communities. To live under fiat is to accept an ongoing gamble. We accept paper and numbers in exchange for labour because we believe others will do the same tomorrow. The confidence is rarely questioned in stable times, but it is never absolute. Every economic downturn, every political crisis, every burst of inflation reawakens doubts. And yet, despite centuries of skepticism, fiat systems have proven remarkably durable. They have underpinned industrial revolutions, world wars, and the growth of global trade. One might ask whether the reliance on trust makes fiat more human than its metallic predecessors. Gold and silver were objects of geology, indifferent to our choices. Fiat money is pure human construction, dependent on institutions, language, and law. In this sense, it embodies our collective ability to create systems out of nothing but agreement. That is both empowering and unsettling. So why does paper have value just because the state says so? Because enough of us choose to believe it, and because the machinery of law and enforcement ensures that belief continues. It works, until it doesn't. The haunting question is not whether fiat is real money. It clearly is, but how long our trust will last. If all money is memory and promise, then fiat is the clearest mirror of ourselves. It reflects our willingness to keep faith with one another, and with the states that bind us, even when the paper in our hands is nothing more than ink and fibre. If 96% of money is digital, does it even exist? When most of us picture money, we still imagine something physical. Coins clinking in a jar, paper bills folded into a wallet, a stack of notes exchanged across a counter. Yet in the late 20th century and early 21st, the majority of money stopped existing in physical form. It became code, a series of numbers glowing on a screen, moving through networks, summoned by a swipe or a tap. This shift is so ordinary now that it hardly seems remarkable, but in historical terms it represents one of the most radical transformations of money in thousands of years. For the first time, money is no longer tied to any object at all. It is entries in databases, pulses of electricity, and agreements stored in servers. That raises an unsettling question. If most money today is intangible, what exactly are we trusting? The transition did not happen all at once. It grew out of the infrastructure of the 20th century. Credit cards were among the first steps, pioneered in the mid-20th century with the Diners Club card in 1950. These were followed by bank-issued cards such as Visa and MasterCard, which spread rapidly in the 1960s and 70s. At first, these cards were not yet fully digital. They relied on slips of paper and carbon copies. But behind the scenes, banks were already building the systems that would soon transform payments into streams of electronic information. By the 1980s, electronic funds transfer and automated teller machines had become routine. Money was turning into data long before most people noticed. The spread of the internet in the 1990s accelerated the shift. Online banking, digital transfers and e-commerce turned the screen itself into the site of exchange. Suddenly you could send value without touching cash, without handling a check, without even entering a bank. The act of paying became abstract. For younger generations, clicking a button on a website or tapping a card at a register became normal. By the early 21st century, in many countries, physical cash accounted for less than 5% of the money supply. The rest existed only as balances recorded in bank computers. This immateriality can be disorienting. When money is paper or coin, it has weight, texture, and presence. When it is code, it is invisible. Yet the same principle holds. It works because people trust it. Your bank account balance is not a pile of bills stored in a vault with your name on it. It is an entry in a ledger. When you buy groceries with a debit card, no cash moves. A few databases adjust their numbers, and the store accepts that adjustment as real payment. The system relies on networks, encryption, and the authority of institutions to ensure that these intangible flows are reliable. Digital wallets and mobile payments extended the abstraction even further. Companies such as PayPal, Alipay, and later Apple Pay and Google Pay turned phones into tools of exchange. In many cities, entire generations barely carry physical cash. A smartphone and a bank account are enough to participate in the economy. This convenience comes at the cost of dependency. To use digital money, you need access to electricity, servers, and networks. Without them, the illusion of instant value transfer collapses. In that sense, the system is more fragile than any physical currency ever was. Cryptocurrency pushed the transformation into stranger territory. Beginning with Bitcoin in 2009, developers attempted to create money without states or banks, relying on decentralized code and consensus rather than institutional trust. Whatever one thinks of its long-term prospects, cryptocurrency showed how far the abstraction of money could go. Here was currency that had no physical existence, no issuing authority, and no intrinsic value, yet could be traded and stored like wealth. Critics call it speculation disguised as money. Supporters call it liberation from centralized control. Either way, it highlights the degree to which money has become an act of imagination sustained by code. Some economists argue that this digital turn simply reveals what money always was, an agreement, not a thing. From shells to coins to paper to banknotes, money worked because people treated it as such. The difference today is scale and speed. Digital systems allow trillions of dollars to move across the globe in seconds. They allow microtransactions smaller than any coin ever minted. They connect billions of people in real time. The economy has become a web of signals, with money flowing like light through cables. Yet there are haunting questions. What happens when the system fails? Power outages, cyber attacks, and systemic crashes can freeze the flow of value. When so much of wealth is data, vulnerabilities multiply. Another question is psychological. Does money feel less real when you never touch it? Studies suggest people spend more freely when paying by card or phone than when handing over cash, perhaps because the pain of parting with tangible money is gone. Digital money changes not only economies but behaviour. So if 96% of money is digital, does it even exist? The answer depends on what we mean by existence. You cannot hold most of it in your hand, but you can exchange it for food, shelter, or travel. It shapes our lives as powerfully as any coin ever did. Its reality lies not in metal or paper, but in code, trust, and networks. We live in an age where money is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, a mirage we all agree to chase. Perhaps the deeper question is whether we still control this mirage, or whether the mirage now controls us. Was money humanity's greatest invention, or our first mistake? It is a question that sits uneasily at the edge of history, because the truth is we cannot tell where invention ends and mistake begins. We know only that somewhere on the shores of the Black Sea in the 5th millennium before our era, people placed gold into graves in patterns that spoke of meaning beyond ornament. They measured and weighed, they assigned value, and they left us the first unmistakable evidence of wealth inequality. That shimmering hoard at Varna is not just the earliest gold, it is one of the earliest mirrors of ourselves, reflecting the possibility that humans had begun to organise their world not only by kinship or ritual, but by material divisions that marked some lives above others. The invention of money, if that is even the right word, was never one moment but a long drift of practices that hardened into systems. Before coins, before weights of silver or measures of grain, there were debts remembered, shells exchanged, and cattle driven as living wealth. Yet the Varna graves remind us that wealth is not simply about exchange. It is about distinction, about who has and who does not. From that 5th millennium site we glimpse one of the first divides. Some bodies were buried with hundreds of gold objects, while others lay without adornment. These burials show that money, or at least proto-money, always carried the weight of hierarchy. It was never neutral. From there the trail winds across millennia. In Mesopotamia silver was tallied. In Egypt gold gleamed as divine. In Lydia metal was stamped into coins. In Greece soldiers were paid for their loyalty. In Rome, emperors' faces became the face of money itself. Every step reinforced the idea that value could be standardized, abstracted, and controlled. But alongside it grew the shadow. Once standardized, value could be manipulated. Debasement, taxation, hoarding, and the concentration of wealth were as old as the very systems that allowed prosperity to spread. Money was not simply a tool. It was a language of power, spoken in metals, shells, paper, and later in code. And yet, money has always been more fragile than it seems. A coin can be clipped, a tally stick can be broken, a digital record can vanish in a surge of lost data. Beneath its many forms lies the same delicate foundation: trust. Trust that the shell will be accepted, that the ingot has weight, that the piece of paper has backing, that the database entry corresponds to something real. Without that collective belief, the entire structure collapses. Perhaps that is the paradox. Money feels solid, yet it is one of the most intangible human inventions, sustained by little more than shared imagination. Still, imagination is powerful. It built cities, mobilized armies, and linked strangers in networks of trade that carried obsidian, spices, silk, and silver across continents. Money allowed a farmer in Anatolia to feed a soldier in Athens, a miner in Spain to fund a temple in Rome, a merchant in China to exchange for furs from the steppe. It connected worlds that might otherwise never have touched, and it did so through a single logic: the idea that value could be transferred, not person to person through trust alone, but through tokens that stood in for trust. But if money is a bridge, it is also a wall. The Varna burials are only the first example of how wealth marks difference. The rise of elites, the appearance of classes, the separation between rich and poor, these are stories that have repeated for 6,000 years. Every new form of money has carried with it the same possibility: to unite through exchange and to divide through accumulation. We can admire the beauty of gold ornaments, the ingenuity of coinage, the cleverness of paper systems, but we cannot ignore that each innovation came with costs measured not in numbers, but in lives lived at the bottom of the scale. Looking back across this long arc, one wonders whether inequality was inevitable once money was born. Did the first shell exchanged already contain the seed of class? Did the first weight of silver already imply debt? Did the first coin stamped with a king's face already bind subjects to a hierarchy as much as it freed them for trade? The archaeological record does not answer these questions directly, but the patterns suggest that money was never simply a convenience. It was a tool of organisation, and like all tools of organisation it could include or exclude. Even today we still carry that legacy. We may not bury gold diadems in graves, but we bury status into neighbourhoods, into education, into access. The materials have changed, but the divide they create feels familiar. The haunting part is that inequality is not an accidental byproduct of money. It is one of its earliest signatures. From the 5th millennium to now, money has told us who belongs where in the order of things. It has been a map not just of trade, but of hierarchy. Does that mean money was a mistake? Perhaps it is better to say that money was a mirror. It reflected back to us the human capacity for abstraction, trust and cooperation, but also for domination, greed and exclusion. It was an invention that magnified both our strengths and our flaws. We cannot separate the two. Without money, vast civilizations might not have risen. Without money, art and science might not have flourished as they did. But without money, we might also have avoided the first deep divides that still shape us today. When we stand in a museum and look at the grave goods from Varna, or the silver shekels from Mesopotamia, or the stamped electrum coins from Lydia, what are we really seeing? Not just objects of value, but fossils of trust and inequality preserved in metal and stone. We are seeing the earliest echoes of decisions that still ripple through modern life. Was money humanity's greatest invention, or its first mistake? The evidence does not allow us to choose one answer cleanly. It seems to have been both. Perhaps the real question is whether we are still inventing money, or whether money has long been inventing us. If we try to peel back the layers of time, what we see is not a straight line, but a shifting mosaic. The very first signs of value exchange are not what we would call money at all. Tens of millennia before temples and markets, small groups of hunter-gatherers moved stones, shells, ochre and beads across astonishing distances. Archaeologists uncover marine shells far inland, pigments hundreds of kilometres from their source, and stone tools fashioned from materials carried across mountain chains. None of this looks like coinage or currency. Instead, it looks like gifts, tokens, fragments of memory that moved through hands as gestures of belonging or alliance. A shell drilled to wear on a string was not just decoration. It was proof that someone else, far away, mattered enough to exchange with. Before money was written down, it was remembered. The Neolithic age complicates this picture further. As people settled into farming villages, raised livestock and built permanent homes, the scale of exchange widened. Domestic animals became more than food. A herd of cattle, a flock of sheep, or a pen of pigs became walking stores of wealth. They could be bred, traded or slaughtered in times of need. They were wealth that reproduced itself. This living currency tied people not just to the land but to each other, because large animals required shared labour, grazing agreements and seasonal management. The price of a bride, a treaty or a debt could be measured in livestock. We have no ledgers from these early centuries, but the pattern is visible in the bones, in the corrals, and in the myths of later societies where wealth was still counted in cows. Alongside animals came minerals. Salt, for example, emerges as one of the most curious early proto-currencies. Necessary for survival, difficult to transport in bulk, and unevenly distributed across landscapes, salt could be shaped into bricks or cakes, and carried to where it was rare. Entire trade routes formed around it. In the archaeological record, the presence of salt production sites and long-distance trails shows that by the 4th and 3rd millennia before our era, salt had become not only a dietary necessity, but also a measure of exchange. To give salt was to sustain life itself, and this necessity gave it a power that later metals would inherit. but metals themselves were already transforming human thought. By the 5th millennium before our era, copper ornaments, tools, and weapons appear across southeastern Europe, and it is in this context that the Varna necropolis on the western shore of the Black Sea tells its strange story. Here, in graves dating to around 45 centuries before our era, gold is found in unprecedented quantities. Necklaces, bracelets, diadems, and beads fill burials in ways we do not see elsewhere at this time. Some bodies are swathed in hundreds of ornaments, while others are laid to rest with almost nothing. The gold itself is not the mystery. It is the concentration, the precision, and the implication that such accumulation meant something more than beauty. Gold at Varna was not currency in the modern sense, but it was already a signal of hierarchy. To be buried with gold was to be marked apart. It tells us that by this early horizon, human communities were already negotiating inequality through material display. Elsewhere in Chalcolithic Europe, at Durankalac or in the vast Cucuteni Tripilia sites, we see other glimpses of complexity. Large settlements with specialized craft production suggest a division of labor far beyond subsistence farming. Pottery painted in intricate designs, loom weights for weaving, and copper axes all point to networks of specialization where goods had to be valued, exchanged, and distributed. Though no coins existed, the principle of standardized production was emerging, and with it, the need to assign value across households and villages. The seeds of later money were sown not by kings or markets, but by communities that needed to coordinate life on a new scale. As we move into the river civilizations of the Near East, the evidence sharpens. In the temples of Mesopotamia, silver emerges not as ornament but as weight. The shekel was not a coin, but a unit of weight tied to silver, used to measure obligations. Workers could be paid in grain rations, but debts and large exchanges were reckoned in silver weights. This was not yet money as a medium in everyone's pocket, but money as accounting. Clay tablets preserve contracts, lists, and tallies, where silver was the standard of reckoning. The fact that temples and palaces controlled much of this silver shows that authority and value were entwined from the start. Money, in its first measurable form, was never separate from power. Egypt presents a different picture. Gold there gleamed with divine associations. From the 3rd millennium before our era, pharaohs accumulated vast amounts of gold, not as a daily medium of exchange, but as a symbol of eternal authority. Tribute and trade brought it from Nubia and beyond, and it flowed into tombs, temples, and ritual objects. For Egyptians, gold's incorruptibility mirrored the eternal. Its role was less about exchange in markets, and more about anchoring the order of society itself. When foreign envoys sent gifts of gold, they were acknowledging Egypt's prestige. Thus gold became a diplomatic and cosmic medium, while Mesopotamia counted silver in weights and obligations. Two parallel logics, both reshaping how humans understood value. By the 7th and 6th centuries before our era, in the Kingdom of Lydia, a more recognizable form of money appears, stamped metal coins. Made from electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, these first coins bore official marks that guaranteed their weight and purity. This was a new leap. No longer did value have to be weighed or tested each time. The stamp carried the authority of the state. Coins allowed for a speed of transaction and a scale of trade previously cumbersome under weight-based systems. From Lydia, the practice spread into Ionia and the wider Greek world, where coinage quickly intertwined with politics, war, and democracy itself. In classical Greece, silver coinage from the mines of Laurion underpinned Athenian power. Soldiers and sailors were not simply rewarded with honour, they were paid in standardised silver. This shift turned military service into a profession, and allowed Athens to sustain fleets that projected power across the Aegean. Coinage thus tied together politics, warfare, and civic identity. A hoplite expected payment, and that payment knit him into the machinery of empire. Money had become a force that could mobilise thousands, not just measure private exchange. Rome took the idea even further. From the 3rd century before our era, the Roman mint produced coins that carried the faces and messages of emperors. To pay legions, to fund infrastructure, to tax provinces, all of it relied on coins that spread across the Mediterranean. But Roman coinage was more than economics. It was propaganda in bronze and silver. Every coin in a soldier's hand bore the image of the authority he served. Every market trader touched the emperor's likeness. Coins became a medium of ideology as much as commerce. Even when the metal was debased, even when inflation gnawed at their worth, the imagery proclaimed stability and control. Far to the east, China charted its own path. Shells were among the earliest tokens of exchange, echoing prehistoric traditions. But by the first millennium before our era, bronze spade and knife-shaped coins circulated, their shapes recalling practical tools but functioning as abstract symbols of value. Later, round coins with square holes came to dominate, strung together on cords. And then, centuries before any other part of the world, the Chinese experimented with paper money under the Song dynasty. Here again, trust and state authority fused. The very idea that paper could hold value rested on belief in imperial backing. What emerges from this long prehistory and early history is not a single invention of money, but multiple threads woven across different landscapes. Livestock and salt, shells and copper, silver and gold, electrum and bronze, paper and authority. Each answered the same problem in its own way: how to measure and transfer value across people who could not rely only on memory and kinship. Each form left behind traces in graves, hoards, tablets or coins that still speak to us today. The haunting question remains whether this deep past reveals more about human ingenuity or about human inequality. The first gold at Varna, the first silver tallies in Mesopotamia, the first stamped coins in Lydia, all are milestones of abstraction, of collective imagination, of coordination on vast scales. But they are also milestones of division. To hold more gold, more silver, more coins, was to hold more power. From the 5th millennium before our era onward, value was never just about survival. It was about status. We cannot resolve whether money was our greatest invention or our first mistake. What we can say is that from the Upper Paleolithic to the empires of Rome and Han, money in its many forms bound people together and set them apart. It carried trust and it carried hierarchy. It measured debt and it proclaimed authority. It crossed deserts and seas, and it settled into the graves of the dead. The story of money is not one of modern finance, but one of deep time, in which human beings learned to make value visible, portable and divisible. That story, stretching from shells to spades to silver to stamped faces, is not finished, but its earliest chapters still lie in the earth, waiting for us to read them with humility and wonder. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for wandering this timeline with me, for drifting into deep time, for slowing down and remembering. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you study, or simply helped you step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the sapiens in your life, and tell me, are you listening before bed, while working, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.